to call to order this Bloomington Common Council special session for the 30th of October 2019. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Piedmont Smith.
Here.
Rallo.
Here.
Volin.
Here.
Sims.
Here.
Sturbaum. Here. Sandberg. Here. Ruff.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Here is the agenda summation this evening, and you may find an agenda at the clerk's desk if you would like one. We have legislation for first reading, 3 items. Those are Ordinance 1923 to amend a planned unit development PUD district ordinance and approve a preliminary plan regarding 1201 West Allen Street, Hilltop Meadow LLC petitioner. Second item is for first reading is Ordinance 1925 to amend Title 8 of the Bloomington Municipal Code entitled Historic Preservation and Protection to establish a historic district regarding the Near West Side Conservation District, Near West Side Historic Designation Committee petitioner. Third item for first reading is Ordinance 1926 to amend the district ordinance and approve a preliminary plan for a planned unit development PUD regarding 3201 East Morse Pike First Capital Group petitioner. After that, we will we'll visit our council schedule before we continue consideration of Ordinance 1924 to repeal and to replace Title 20 of the Bloomington Municipal Code entitled Unified Development Ordinance. This evening, we're considering Chapter 6, which is Administration Procedures, and Chapter 7, Definitions. Then we will have consideration of written objections per Indiana Code 3674606C3. And then we will have consideration of other matters or actions related to the proposal ready to be raised at this meeting before we recess. So with that, let's proceed to legislation for first reading.
Mr. President, I move that Ordinance 1923 be introduced and read by title and synopsis only.
Second.
Motion has been made to introduce Ordinance 1923 by title and synopsis only. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Will the clerk please read?
Ordinance 1923 to amend a planned unit development district ordinance and approve a preliminary plan regarding 1201 West Allen Street, Hilltop Meadow LLC petitioner. The synopsis is as follows. Ordinance 1923 would amend an existing PUD and approve a PUD district ordinance and preliminary plan to allow a new multifamily residential development.
Thank you. I think that we need to consider a motion to refer this item to the Land Use Committee.
So
and
moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. We have only one cycle remaining, do we not, to hear this? And so we will have to have an expeditious hearing by the Land Use Committee to return this item by December 4th. Is that correct, Mr. Sherman?
Yes, as I mentioned in the memo that's in front of you, many of you probably haven't been able to read it, but usually this will be returned on December 4th after 2 legislative cycles. We've wiped out our legislative cycles in November, so we're in new territory here. If we were to go to the last meeting of the year, we would exceed the 90 days. So our next regular opportunity is December 4th. So I suggest that the motion include a return of a report to the regular session on that date.
So it would be wise to prepare any reasonable conditions prior to that meeting. Is that correct? By the Land
Puts
Use
a lot
Committee.
of work on the plate for the Land Use Committee next week, and they should perhaps more time than they usually envision, maybe 2 hours or.
So we should allow 2 hours for that meeting?
Whatever it would take to handle
These
those
two
issues.
items, Ordinance 1926 will also be something for us to consider.
That's, if you look
But
there,
keep in mind, they're looking to withdraw that request, so that's not that much work.
Yeah.
1925, is that coming to Land Use Committee as well? I didn't think so. So we just have the one item.
One item.
I think it's okay.
So should we plan on 2 hours is the question. Members of the Land Use Committee, I'd like to hear.
I have a question about a point of information. So in the memo on the first page, it says, according to the provision in the Bloomington Municipal Code, the Committee of the Whole and Land Use Committee must meet on the second and fourth Wednesdays of the month. So now, but we're talking about a meeting on November 6th, which is the first Wednesday, so I'm a bit confused.
A motion by a majority of the council to schedule for next week overrides the code. You're allowed to change your schedule with a majority vote.
Okay.
Can I, sorry, Mr. Chair,
Please, Councilmember Hall.
can I ask, what is our schedule again for the week of November 20th? Is there, what do we have scheduled for
Two nights set
UDO?
aside for the UDO. that
Which
would-
nights? Tuesday and Wednesday? Or
I
Wednesday and
think you're right.
Thursday?
I think it's Tuesday and Wednesday. Yeah.
So there will be time to hear it on the 20th, or the Thursday of that week, 21st. Oh, boy, the 21st. Yeah, no, we can't do the 21st. We may have to just turn it back in one meeting.
That's what I
This
thought
is-
you'd conclude.
We can deal with that on the 6th, though.
So
So
the
2
proposal-
hours? 2 hours on the next week?
Do we have any, what else is for next? what
There
else?
are a number of things coming up during council schedule, and what I actually have suggested is that right now, you just refer it to the
Yeah,
land
yeah,
use.
2 hours will be fine. Yeah.
Refer it to the land use committee for consideration next week, and then under council schedule, I can tell you about what else is
Okay.
happening next week, and you figure out the times and the start date, the start times.
Okay.
Okay, so the
But in the
motion is to refer to Land Use Committee, and they'll hear it on November 6th.
Yes, and there's a second, and I'd like a roll call vote on this. Clerk Bolden, could you call the roll on the motion?
Councilmember Ruff,
Yes.
Chopra,
Yes.
Piedmont Smith,
Yes.
Rallo,
Yes.
Volin,
Yes?
Sims,
Yes.
Sturbaum. Sandberg.
Yes.
Motion carries 9-0. Very good. Let's
8-0.
proceed now to,
Mr. Chair, I move that ordinance 1925 be introduced and read by title and synopsis only.
there's a motion to introduce ordinance 1925 by title and synopsis only. All in favor, say aye. Any opposed? Will the clerk please read?
Ordinance 1925 to amend Title 8 of the Bloomington Municipal Code entitled Historic Preservation and Protection to establish a historic district regarding the Near West Side Conservation District, Near West Side Historic Designation Committee petitioner. The synopsis is as follows. This ordinance amends the list of designated historic districts located in the city of Bloomington and set forth in Chapter 8.20 of the Municipal Code by establishing the Near West Side Conservation District. In recommending this designation, the Bloomington Historic Preservation Commission conducted a survey, held public hearings, and submitted a map and accompanying report to the council. The map describes the boundaries of the district, classifies the total number of properties within the district, and is approved by the ordinance. The report demonstrates how this district meets the necessary criteria. A conservation district is, in general, less restrictive than a full historic district and requires only the review of proposals to demolish or move buildings or construct new principal or accessory buildings. At the end of 3 years after adoption of this ordinance, this conservation district will elevate into a full historic district unless within 180 and 60 days before that date, a majority of the property owners provide the commission with written objections to the elevation.
Thank you.
Chair, I move that ordinance 1926 be introduced and read by title and synopsis only.
There's been a motion to introduce ordinance
Mr. Chair,
1926
point
by
of
title
order.
and synopsis only.
Point of order.
Yes.
If we would want to not introduce this legislation, we could vote no to have it read by the clerk. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the petitioner is asked to withdraw it, so
Yes. So let's have a roll call vote on
thank you, yes.
on the introduction of ordinance 1926.
Councilmember Chopra?
No.
Piedmont Smith?
No.
Rallo?
No.
Volin?
No?
Sims?
No.
Sturbaum?
No.
Sandberg?
No.
Ruff? Thank you.
Thank you. Ordinance 1926 fails to be introduced 0 to 9. So now we'll visit the council schedule.
Excuse me, point of order at 08.
9 people here. 8.
8-0.
Oh, I'm sorry. Forgot Councilmember Granger's not here. 08. Moving on to council schedule, Mr. Sherman.
There are two matters for your attention. One is rather simple. I'll start with that one. You are scheduled for a joint work session on Friday. At this point, there's no legislation for you to consider. You might have other reasons for meeting, or otherwise you can decide to cancel. I'll leave that up to you.
Is there a motion to cancel our work session?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Our work session is canceled.
Thank you. The other item is all about next week. It's the first Wednesday of the month. We've already scheduled for Committee of the Whole via the annual schedule. Earlier this evening, you've brought the Land Use Committee in for that evening as well. Because we've wiped away the rest of our regular sessions for the month, I'm suggesting we have one next week, because statute said you should have a regular meeting every month, and this is the one meeting in November where you're not taking up the UDO, so I thought it's a good time to take care of that obligation. So there are three items. I suggest this is a time to think about, decide what meetings you want and when they should start. So
5:30 to 7:30.
Okay.
Followed by committee.
there's Land Use Committee, there's a regular session. By the way, where you should actually hear the Affordable Living Committee report, and that'll be in your packet this week. Other than that, it's just meeting that obligation under statute to meet. And then there's the Committee of the Whole. You've just introduced a historic designation ordinance that would need discussion, and that would be a good time to do it.
Well, I'd like to comment on it first. So I want to suggest that it would be good to have the Land Use Committee go first, because it's possible that the committee might dispose of the legislation and they will send it right back to council, which would meet immediately after. So they could take action as early as November 6 on it. I'm just saying it's possible if we voted it with no recommendation. Having said that, I have a conflict. I can't be here till 6. So if we started at 5:30, I wouldn't be able to be there for the first half hour, which is fine. The rest of the committee can hear it, but I'm sort of at sea as to what to suggest here. I just as soon have the council regular session and committee of the whole go first, but I defer to my colleagues on the Land Use Committee. So I don't know what to propose.
What, do you mind?
Councilmember Tripper.
Why would we start at 5:30?
The idea is that because we only have an opportunity for a single hearing before the Land Use Committee, that it may require up to 2 hours. And so I think Councilmember Volin was suggesting 5:30 to 7:30 to be followed by the Committee of the Whole in regular session.
But I thought he also just said he couldn't be there at 5:30.
Yes, but he's
So I have not made a motion yet. That was, that's what we've done in the past. We've had a 5:30 meeting to get the Land Use Committee out of the way as early as possible so that we can get the meeting that requires all 9 members to be there as early as possible.
If we meet afterwards, that would help your schedule.
Yeah, I would be fine with that.
And we don't know how long the meeting might take. Those are,
The
they might
upshot
be
is,
relatively simple items to dispose of.
Mr.
Yeah,
Chair.
I think Land Use Committee second would make sense.
Yeah, let's do that.
Mi-
More
Mis-
efficient.
Mr. Chair.
Councilmember Volin.
Yeah, the only issue there would be that the council as a whole it would be better if they limited the amount of time for that near West Side meeting. So, I mean, if we could say that it'll be 1 hour or an hour and a half, so that the starts of the meetings would be predictable, that's the only thing I would ask. I would hate to have the people who are there for the Land Use Committee have to wait an indeterminate amount of time because they don't know when the council will be done with the regular session. So if the council would be willing to say, we'll meet at 6:30 and we'll be done by 8, and then the Land Use could take it up at 8. I'd like to move that the regular session occur as scheduled, Committee of the Whole after that, and that Land Use Committee begin no earlier than 8 p.m. I need a second.
No later than what?
8
no
PM.
later than 8 PM.
I have a question.
Mr. Sherman, do you,
Oh, sorry, no earlier than 8 PM. My apology. No earlier than 8 PM.
I'd like to hear Mr. Sherman's opinion.
My question.
Is that workable?
Well,
Yes, just a
I
moment.
guess one question, no later or no earlier than. If you want to have a predictable time, you want no later than. Well, I guess it
I
doesn't
don't have
matter.
control over the council's time during its regular session, so I can't,
I see.
I mean,
All
the
right.
council has to agree to that timing.
You can do what's being proposed. It's new for us to set a time limit on a regular committee session, or committee of the whole, but you could do that. If I'm just looking ahead at what's the workload, I think the regular session is pretty brief. Councilmember Sandberg, how much time do you think you need, and Sturbaum, how much time do you need on the report?
I think, isn't the normal time for a committee report 20 minutes, and we may need
Yeah.
less than that?
Okay.
So that's the substantive part of the night. You may get some public comment, but, so it's expected to be a short meeting. The Near West Side Conservation District, it involves hundreds of properties. There's an active committee that has been working on this for a while. They'll want to talk about it. But you've been through conservation districts before. They're not interminable in terms of your time.
Councilmember Sturbaum had a question or comment.
My question was, we're getting used to starting at 6. That would be an option. But also, I would like to start when the committee is over and let people wait a little bit. They can do it. They've waited long enough to get their hearing,
Well,
so,
there's a motion on the table.
yeah,
so-
that's how I would suggest
Councilmembers,
doing it.
Piedmont Smith.
I wanted to have some clarity on the motion. Is it that the Land Use Committee will start at 8 or no earlier than 8?
You want to clarify the motion?
I'll restate it. Move that council meet at 6:30 as usual, and the Land Use Committee meet no earlier than 8 PM.
Yes, all right, I support that.
Right.
So I second my second.
All right.
Okay.
So that way, there's time if we go longer.
Any more discussion?
Call the question.
Second.
Okay, the question's been called and seconded on the motion. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Try that again. Councilmember Piedmont Smith,
Yes.
Rallo,
Yes.
Volin,
Yes?
Sims,
Yes.
Sturbaum,
Yes.
Sandberg,
Yes.
Ruff,
Yes.
Chopra.
Okay, the motion carries 8-0. Thank you. Anything else regarding schedule?
No, thank you.
All right. We'll now move on to item 5, which is a continuation of consideration of Ordinance 1924 to repeal and replace Title 20 of the Bloomington Municipal Code entitled Unified Development Ordinance. And this evening, we will hear introduction to proposed Unified Development Ordinance UDO Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. Mr. Robertson, would you like to proceed with Chapter 6?
Good evening. My name is Scott Robinson. I'm the Assistant Director for Planning and Transportation. Thank you for having me this evening. Like last time, or preceding presentations, I'll try to be brief. I do want to provide an opportunity to clarify or follow up some questions that were asked at the last hearing. I'll try to go through these quickly. There was a comment regarding definitions of annual median income and some affordability tiers used by HUD. Again, staff recommends that we do not include these in the UDO. There's clear federal programs and Housing and Urban Development Agency that has these definitions. We would prefer to reference those. There was some discussion about primary facade in the downtown district and design modifications. We carry forward all the design standards from the current code. I will say that since the last couple of years, we've had an architect on retainer that's been helpful to provide some additional feedback on designs with our guidelines, and I think that's been helpful to incorporate more suitable design outcomes from those projects. Universal design was mentioned As far as how it's been addressed in the Unified Development Ordinance, staff had prepared an amendment during the Plan Commission process that was never discussed or introduced, so we do have an amendment that we'd be happy to work with the council member on incorporating that. One of the concerns that we have is generally a lot of the universal design standards relate to building code, which we don't have any regulatory or review approval, but there are some options that we can consider. LED lighting for streetlights. The city currently has been working with Duke since 2016. They have offered LED street lighting. The city owns some streetlights since 2010. They have incorporated LED lighting, I believe, in all city-owned streetlights. As part of the 2020 goal from Public Works, they hope to develop a program with Duke to transition all the remaining streetlights to use LED bulbs. Floodplain standards are confusing. Staff has worked with the state to comply with their state standards. We have our local standards. They don't conflict with one another, but it is confusing when you read that section. We've reached out to a council member or two about possible amendments to help clarify that. Fence standards, this council approved fence standards not too long ago. Those all carried forward. We haven't changed them, so if there are concerns, again, I think that's something that council will have to consider. Neighborhood meetings, currently it's only required for rezones. We've added additional neighborhood meetings for site plan approvals and zoning map changes. Staff has always recommended development petitioners to reach out to neighborhoods to have those meetings. So again, just want to clarify that neighborhood meetings have been added or expanding that requirement. Downtown step back standards for historic structures. There was a question about why contributing structures has been removed. That's really a policy question. One of the things that's new in this ordinance is there's transition rules to adjacent neighborhoods and single-family structures that both the height and setback standards would have to reflect that change, so it could be an additional impact to the downtown. Obviously, we're trying to balance growth and where the growth happens. Generally, the downtown is an area that we've encouraged a lot of growth, so this was just a policy question that's up for consideration. Firewall, there was a question about when firewalls would be required if multi-units were being built. We contacted Monroe County Building Department. Again, that's something that would be required through the building department and their specifications. Conditional use approvals, there was some questions about criteria and standards. I just have a snippet here in the current code up in the upper right. You kind of see the process. So anytime there's a conditional use, there's a process as far as pre-meetings, neighborhood meetings notice, and hearings, and then the two sections I cut out of the code are additional standards. So even if the conditional met all the standards within the UDO, there's additional criteria that the decision-making body, in this case it would be the Board of Zoning Appeals and or the hearing officer, that they can consider, and one of them is the comprehensive plan. So I did want to point out that there are additional criteria in the code that could be weighed, and those decision-making bodies are not compelled to approve something if they meet all the standards. They can consider other criteria. So with that, I'm going to move on to Chapter 6. Again, this is the chapter dealing with...
Mr. Robinson, could we just make sure that everyone's at peace with that, those clarifications? Are there any questions from council on the clarifications? Councilmember Volin.
I've paused the timer. First of all, have all the slideshows that you've presented been sent to the council?
I believe all of them have been, but I can...
I mean, has there been any change in this slideshow from, say, last week? I mean, do we have a copy of this?
This is a new presentation. I've sent last week to council. This is a new presentation.
Okay, so we'll get this after tonight.
That's correct, and we plan to send some other information on housing data that we've been collecting as well.
Okay, so, I mean, I'm looking at the significant changes memo of the UDO. Is it safe to say that there have been some changes that are not in the memo since this was issued?
Can you restate the question, please?
Well, I'm looking at the 13-page significant changes memo to the UDO adoption draft, and that was issued, I think, at the beginning of this process a month ago. Is it safe to assume that there are some changes that are not in this memo that, for example, what you just showed us was a reaction to some council comments from last time, wasn't it?
The memo is still current. I mean, the code hasn't
Right.
changed, so that memo is accurate. I'm just reflecting responses to those questions, and some of those might trigger changes to the code depending on what council.
Okay, that's, I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any further questions from council on the clarifications? Councilmember Sturbaum?
Yeah, on summary table of review procedures 2006030, it says for conditional use permit, the neighborhood meeting is not checked in that table. And I would suggest that maybe it should be. And then, I'll let you respond to that first, because that's not what you just said.
So again, we did expand neighborhood meetings, but it does not include conditional uses. So that, if that's a change that council wants to consider, that's.
Right. And then the minor site plan review is administrative only, which sounds like it makes sense, except when you're building an apartment project that has sustainable development incentives. One of the incentives is to waive the procedure of the major site plan, which involves neighborhood and review. So it means that if you're doing a large project and you're getting those incentives, you don't have to notify neighbors. It can be handled at the administrative level. And this is one line that worried me. If the project is located adjacent.
Councilmember Sturbaum?
Yeah, may I ask this? I'm asking a question.
Yes, but this pertains to Chapter 6, and I think that we haven't, we're going to go to Chapter 6 soon. So
In
we
this
were-
Chapter 6, it
Yeah,
says.
but what we heard were the change, the comments from last week. He hasn't presented.
I was referring to questions on the clarifications that were made
Okay, I was
prior to
confused
this.
by,
So let's hold off on that question.
we'll wait for the presentation.
And if there are no other questions regarding those clarifications, then let's proceed to Chapter 6, Administration and Procedure. Mr. Robinson, thank you.
So excuse me, Chapter 6, this is just all the sections in Chapter 6. Again, it's reorganizing a lot of the information that we have now. One of the things I highlighted on the bottom is enforcement and penalties. One of the things I wanted to bring to your attention that when we did our notification to all property owners about the update of the process, there's a different requirement if we were to change the enforcement and/or penalties. So I just want to bring that to your attention that that section has not changed. And again, if you were to change the fines and penalties, that would trigger a different notification process. So again, these are the sections in the chapter. I'm not going to go over each of the sections. I'm just going to try to highlight some of the changes in organization. The first section is just general. It really gives the purpose of the chapter and what types of processes and permits our department reviews and what approvals go through and which bodies review those. It does talk about enforcement. It does identify all the decision-making bodies, which I listed here, Common Council, Plan Commission, Board of Zoning Appeals, staff, Planning and Transportation Department, Hearing Officer, and Plat Committee. With those, it identifies who those agents, those groups are, their composition, their rules, and et cetera in this chapter. So again, it just clarifies who those decision-making bodies are and what types of cases they hear. Some of the rules of each of those bodies have been incorporated into noticing requirements and et cetera that are reflected in there. Other things that we've seen in Chapter 6, such as submittal requirements and those sorts of things, are going to be pulled out of the UDO as part of an administrative manual to help streamline Chapter 6, so like types of files that somebody needs to apply for a permit, those sorts of things have been pulled out. This is a nice summary of Chapter 6 as far as types of procedures that are governed by the UDO, so site plans or a sign permit. There's a whole range of those. And then if you read the table, it identifies which section in Chapter 6 where you can find that process or procedure. It talks about public notice, about which ones would be required to have a published notice in the paper, either a mailed notice to adjacent property owners or posted. So again, different public notice requirements. Talks about pre-submittal requirements, types of things that happen here at the city before it goes to the public hearings. And then the last column details or outlines types of decisions that are made and which governing body is making those decisions. And there's a little code there about, are they reviewing and making a recommendation? Is it a decision, an appeal? And then there's asterisks for public hearings. So that's just a real simple chart to cross-reference those different processes. So one of the things that this does differently than the current UDO is it pulled out all the similarities through all our different processes and combined them into a common review procedures, so it removes all the redundancy that you might see in our current code. Again, I mentioned that we removed some of the administrative stuff as far as submittal requirements and what have you. And we incorporated public notice requirements based on which board and commission and their rules. So for example, for major approvals, which go to the Plan Commission or BZA, those are 21-day notice. And for minor, for hearing officer or plat committee, those are 10 days. There's criteria mentioned for just 3 categories: general compliance, conditional uses, which I just gave you an example of that, as well as zoning map, plats, and PUD requirements. So that just gives you criteria of how some decisions are made in addition to the standards in UDO. So outside of the general requirements, it gets into more specific standards. So on the left-hand column, you see a whole list of different either procedures or permits that our department reviews. So each one of those spells out a section of the process and approvals that go through that. Generally, anything that is required for public hearing goes to, Board of Zoning Appeals, Plan Commission, or Common Council. But then there's permits and things that staff do. For example, again, I mentioned a sign permit, or if a single family residence for a construction permit or an accessory structure, a fence, those kind of things staff would review. So those would be things would be considered like a minor site plan review versus a major site plan review. Any kind of variance, conditional use, any types of those requests, those are not held at staff level. Those are required to go to one of the decision-making bodies, so I just wanted to clarify that. There is a new section that is being considered to allow for some flexibility and relief. Generally, these are our small variances, so sometimes there might be a setback of 1 or 2 feet, or the lot width or depth might not be big enough. So what this does is allow for some small percentages to give some little give in the exact numbers of some of the standards. So these could be done at staff level. Again, these, if you do the percentages, they don't equate to much, but it does relieve the need to go to a variance process for a pretty small, minor variance. So that's essentially what this table outlines, and again, it clearly outlines what the percentages are and which standards are being targeted for these relief procedures. And that's all that I have for Chapter 6. I tried to make it brief, and again, I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. We'll now go to council questions, and I think I would like to go first to Councilmember Sturbaum so he can finish his question.
Right, sorry I jumped the gun on that. So I was just talking about the difference between site review minor and site plan review major. In the major, you check all the boxes, you publish, you mail, you have a pre-submittal meeting, you meet with neighbors. But if it's minor, you don't do any of those things. There's a pre-submittal meeting and it's entirely staff, which is efficient. But I was pointing out that the exception is that when a developer is getting incentives to do either affordability or green incentives, the traditional notification of residential neighbors doesn't happen because it shifts from major site plan review to minor. and it said the limit is if the apartment has 50 units or fewer, it can have this review, this minor review, even though it's adjacent to single-family neighborhoods. So that seems to me to be going overboard in helping make that easier to develop at the expense of waiving some regulations that would be responsible to let the neighborhood know what's happening, what's going in, and they'll find out after the decision is made and the foundation's going in. So I wondered what you say about that.
There's a point of clarification. So in those instances, if it's adjacent to single family, then it would have to follow a major site plan review and not a minor.
Because it's adjacent to,
That's correct.
well, that's
The
good.
only instance that would be minor is if it is not adjacent to those single-family districts, and it is below those thresholds. That is seen as an incentive, a process an incentive to encourage affordability. But those larger projects, regardless of their size, if they met that minimum threshold, if they're adjacent to single-family residential uses, they would have to follow the major site plan approval process and notification.
If the project is located adjacent to R1, R4, and contains more than 50 dwelling units, major site plan review will be required. That means if it contains less than fewer dwelling units, there is a minor site plan review. That's what it says. That's why I'm worried about it. Let's review that later, because it literally says that.
Could you mention the page that you're referring to?
I'm on the significant changes memo, page 10.
Thank you.
It's the top of that page. Okay, that's all I have for the moment.
All right. We'll go on to Councilmember Volin. We'll go to Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yes, when you had on your slide the different decision-making bodies or entities, you left out the floodplain administrator, and I'm wondering who that is for the city, and if you could talk a little bit about that person's role, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I didn't include all the decision-making bodies. So we used to have a certified floodplain manager in our department. Staff is currently working on achieving that certification, but I'm going to defer to Jackie to help me out on this question. So,
Jackie Scanlon, Development Services Manager. The floodplain administrator is traditionally the senior zoning compliance planner, and that position is currently held by Elizabeth Carter. So she's only had that position for a couple of months. So she's going to be in the process of becoming a certified floodplain administrator. And what that, my understanding is what that has come down to in the past is that is the person who fills the role for the city when there are when their sign-off is needed for letters of map amendment or map change to the floodplain that they would be submitting to the state. So we can find out more information about what exactly that role fills for you for next time, if that's okay. I'm not exactly sure what all the details. I mean, she's basically the main contact. That role in the past has been the main contact. We don't do that much development in the floodplain currently, so it's kind of always been a partial secondary part of that position. Not basically one of her very main duties because that things just don't come up that much about it. But I can give you a more rounded description of exactly what she does there after tonight. Is that all right?
So it's mainly looking at the floodplain maps, or would she also do any approvals for development in floodplains?
I don't believe she signs off on any of the approvals. I'd have to check to see how it was written in the new code, but basically the way that some items that were carried over from the previous code would require either a conditional use approval or a variance approval to do development in the floodplain, and that would come from the Board of Zoning Appeals or the hearing officer.
Thank you.
Councilmember Vaughan?
Yeah, I wanted just sort of an illustration, a story that goes with the flexibility and relief procedures. The flexibility and relief procedures 2006-80. Can you give us an example of how this would benefit somebody, just like maybe a recent case where if this law had been in place, it would have been useful?
Sure, I'll give you my experience as a hearing officer. So
Sure.
generally, hearing officers hear cases that staff determines aren't very controversial. So usually it's fences and side yard setbacks. Generally, if adjacent property owners are notified about that, and when we have a hearing, if there is concern from residents, then the hearing officer will defer that up to the Board of Zoning Appeals. So that's kind of the vetting process. And generally, oftentimes, we're approving variances of a foot or two for a side yard setback, and oftentimes, the existing structure has already violated the setback, and they're just doing a small addition to the house, and so it's kind of a, we're not really doing much harm, giving the neighbors an opportunity. So the administrative flexibility relief would alleviate that process of going to the hearing officer if it says, well, hey, if it's within a certain percentage, we can administratively approve that waiver or standard of
And
that
again,
setback.
if someone has an issue with the way that staff has handled some other case, like say that they're a neighbor, they don't like the way it's happened, that it's been managed by staff, to whom do they appeal? To an officer or to BZA or to somebody else?
There are appeals processes outlined in here on how to rectify those situations. Again, if you look at the percentages, they're pretty small when you're looking at it.
Oh, no, I don't mean but for this. I mean, just in general, if for any reason that someone is dissatisfied with the way that a given petition has been administered through staff, are there different appeals? I mean, like there's...
Generally, it goes to the Board of Zoning Appeals.
BZA, that's what I thought. Okay, thank you.
Further council questions on Chapter 6?
First round.
First round, Councilmember Ruff.
This is just a quick general question. Is there anything in this chapter of this proposed draft that gives the Plan Commission any authority or power or decision-making? I mean, I know most of this is, a lot of it's just determined by state law, state code. But does it do anything to give the Plan Commission any kind of power or decision-making that the council could have if we so choose? Whether that's historically always the way it's been in Bloomington or whether it's new to this document, it doesn't matter to me. Just is there anything in there that is something that the council could, by choice, do rather than the Plan Commission?
I'm not aware of that. I'd have to check. Again, we're pretty much following our practice that we're doing now. I'm not aware of anything, and we're deferring to what state code enables. Do you have a specific instance that you're considering?
No, and that's
Councilmember
why
Ruff?
I mentioned whether, I'm not really concerned about whether or not it's historically we've done it or not, whether it's just a carryover from a previous draft or not. I just would like to know if there's anything in there that the Plan Commission is doing that the council could be reserving to ourselves. That's all. If someone could maybe consider that, look into that sometime, that'd be great. Thanks.
Further first round questions? Okay, so we'll go to second round. Councilmember Strobel.
Yeah, just one. This came up at the Plan Commission, and I intend to bring it back. It's a demolition delay permit. And the point that I'm trying to make is that a contributing structure is part of a historic set of buildings. That's why it's contributing. It's an important piece. But this says that if only 50% of it is going to be demolished, it can be reviewed by staff and not go through the Historic Commission. And the criteria that staff is to use is whether it should be locally designated. But standing alone, a contributing structure by its own definition means it does not stand alone. So the definition that does this building that does not stand alone, if it doesn't stand alone, we'll tear it down. So it's bypassing the consideration of the council, because the commission often thinks, and usually lets these go anyway, because it's not worth bringing to the council. But if it's an important part of a district and it just gets demolished 50%, what it's going to do is lose its rating. And I'm suggesting the criteria should be, does it change from contributing to non-contributing through that demolition? And that is what needs to be reviewed. If it's going to lose its historic status by that demolition, it should go through the Historic Commission one last time for a review. And this way it's accidentally bypassing in order to make it more easily done by staff. So it's a fine point, but we'll be talking about it later, and I wondered what your position on that was, or your explanation of that.
Okay. So currently, as you know, probably better than most people here, these are the current standards, and that applies to contributing structures that only appear on the 14 or 15 and that survey. And that was a compromise that this body came up with when they realized that all of those mid-century properties had been added to the survey, and people did not want their contributing structures going to the Historic Preservation Commission. So that's why those were left to staff's review.
That was before the new survey.
So now we have a new survey for 2018, and what the new the proposed UDO, included in the proposed UDO is that all contributings will now be treated the same, where under our current rules, 2001 contributings go to historic preservation, the things that the staff person can review are contributing structures that are having partial demolition in single-family zoning districts. And I think what you're saying is that the issue is that was raised by staff of that commission and our staff and legal is that with the amendment that came forward at Plan Commission is that would be changing, he would be using different criteria than the commission uses to make the determination. But from what I'm hearing you say tonight, maybe you're saying he should be using different criteria, but instead of then recommending to count, then he's recommending it to go on to HPC if he thinks, I'm just trying to get at what you want us to look at.
Just change the criteria for when it should be reviewed by staff. And the criteria would be, does it risk losing its rating? That should be the criteria. And if it risks losing its rating, then it should be
Okay,
reviewed.
so we'll probably have to keep talking about it.
We have two things we got to work out.
Sure.
We should talk before I bring them forward.
Great, thanks.
Thanks.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yes, I'd like to go back to a question brought up by Councilmember Sturbaum that I've been investigating while other questions are being answered. So it was this minor site plan review question that there's some concern, and I have the same concern that projects that are taking advantage of the affordable housing or sustainable development incentives would only go through minor site plan review without the neighborhood meeting and without necessarily the Plan Commission hearing. And it says here, so this is on page 257, projects that qualify for affordable housing incentives and/or sustainable development incentives, provided that if located adjacent to one or more lots in an R1, R2, R3, or R4 district, such project does not contain more than 50 dwelling units. So I guess I'm a little confused about, and then when I did look at the memo of the summary of changes, it did say it's adjacent to so the exception to minor review is if the project is located adjacent to residential zoning and contains more than 50 dwelling units. So from what Mr. Robinson was saying earlier, that should say or contains more than 50 dwelling units. So, I would like there to be review even if there's only 20 dwelling units, if it's right next door to a single family district.
Thank you. Terry Porter, Director of Planning and Transportation. I did find a discrepancy between the highlighted 12-page memo of major changes and then Section 2004, Development Standards 2004-110, in Part 3 under Administration, where it says projects that qualify for the Affordable Housing Incentive and/or the Sustainable Development Incentive established in Section 2004-110 incentives shall have the site plan portion of the petition processed as a minor rather than major site plan, except when the project is adjacent to a lot in the R1, R2, R3, or R4 zoning district, or contains more than 50 dwelling units. So both of those criteria apply. So if it is next to a residential area, it is reviewed as a major site plan, and if it has more than 50 dwelling units, it is reviewed as a major site plan.
That's great. So what page was it that you were reading from?
In my copy, it's page 198, but specifically it's 20.04.110 incentives, and then it's B, general standards, and 3, administration, and it's letter B under administration.
So in the section that talks about the incentives?
Yes. So if there are inconsistencies elsewhere in the full document, then we need to find those and explain those and change them. But that's
okay. But the intention was to have a major site plan review with, if it's 50 units or more, or adjacent to residential.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Continuing with questions from council. Councilmember Sturbaum, do you have any time remaining?
Really, I just comment that that solves the problem. That's great. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Councilmember Sims, do you have a question? No? Okay. Seeing no other questions on Chapter 6, we'll go to the public. If you have a comment, please step to the podium, state your name, and sign in. And this is for Chapter 6.
Good evening, members of the council. My name is David Keppel. Forgive me if I've misunderstood something this evening, but I've been very interested to hear, as I understood or misunderstood, that conditional use does not, in fact, require approval, that there remains an element of discretion before the approval of a conditional use. I personally find that encouraging. I think it's very important, as Councilmember Sturbaum was emphasizing in another context, that when we're dealing with controversial uses which have both benefits and potential harms, that there be flexibility to tailor the city's response to the particular factors. I would even encourage, I'm now getting out of the purview slightly of tonight's agenda, but that when you are considering such uses, you attach language that is neither 100% nor 0, that gives some element of flexibility in then the judgment of whether a project should be approved. So I simply want to say, I like what I'm hearing about conditional uses. I encourage the city to consider the risks when a particular use is in question, and then to put the petitioner through a very thorough review process, including the neighbors, so that you can determine whether this particular use has adverse impact on the community. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
Hi, I'm John Fiedler, and I had a couple specific kind of questions about Chapter 6. Specifically, I think it was 20.06.90-C-4-D. The
Could you say that number again, please?
20.06.90-C-4-D to the nonconforming uses. And it's going through the lawful nonconforming uses, basically grandfathering in things. And what struck me is that talking about an abandonment of a nonconforming use, and the one I'm thinking specifically, which I care most about, is owner occupancy requirements. We still have some grandfathered in. It appears that it's a landlord would only have to file paperwork once right after this UDO passes, and then they would be grandfathered in forever. And I was wondering why that wouldn't be a periodic registration requirement to keep them up to date on that nonconforming use. And then the other question I had was in enforcement. Again, the main concern being owner or occupancy requirements. The Planning and Transportation Department, the director, I believe, is specifically called out as the enforcement officer. And it's unclear if the enforcement is the planning department going around and interviewing, if it's purely complaint-driven. What criteria are used to determine violations? Obviously some violations are very obvious, but occupancy requirements have been very in flux. You go out and interview and they're like, oh no, we only have 3 people here. There's 5 cars parked in the yard every single night. So it's unclear how that's a 3-person residence. And the one interesting idea from the city of West Lafayette was the landlords and the tenants had to submit a signed affidavit, so a legally binding document every year saying who lived in each dwelling that was rented out. And so this encouraged the tenants, not to lie, saying we only have 3, because if you're not on a signed affidavit, you would not have all of the rights as a tenant. And landlords obviously only want the people that have signed the lease in there too. So if, I guess I'm proposing that we add some sort of stronger enforcement language specifically for the occupancy. This comes into play in the downtown core neighborhoods next to university, where there's a lot of student rentals, and we can all cite examples of over-occupied student rentals too. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Further comment from the public on Chapter 6? All right, seeing none, we'll back to council for questions, follow-up questions, and we probably have a few that evolved. Councilmember Volin?
Yeah, I wanted to take up some of those questions. So if, let me time myself too. Is the affidavit, I've seen the affidavit that West Lafayette uses where both the landlord and the tenant sign it. Is that a question for a different part of code, or is that a question that touches upon Title 20?
That is a question that it's not part of Title 20. That would be through HAND in their registered rental program, and that's something that HAND has considered.
Okay. And then what was the other question he asked? I wrote down.
The other one was about, again, probably related to HAND, it's occupancy requirements.
Well, yeah, no, it was the, is HAND the enforcement officer for, where it said that the director of planning was the enforcement officer for establishing whether something is 5 when it should be 3. Where is that in code? What duties does the director of planning have to enforce any part of code, if any, like directly?
I'll have to look at the enforcement sections, but generally there are grandfathered properties with the 5 unrelated adults and 3, so that would regulate under the zoning ordinance. But again, generally the rental, registered rental and that occupancy is a different question, I guess. The question to enforcement, largely we operate on a complaint basis, but oftentimes one complaint triggers a proactive approach to others. So when I was in that position, when I first started working here at the city, one of the changes that happened with the zoning code was to put screening around dumpsters. And so often that started out with a complaint, and then once one business got a warning, hey, you need to screen your dumpster, then they would name, 5 other their neighbors. And so that's generally how the process works. We do get a lot of inquiries about complaints through U-reports and other means, but that's generally how enforcement happens.
The last question I have, it came up because of what I heard in public comment, but is there a possibility that if a property owner intentionally leaves property vacant, that that could be regulated? Is such a thing as a vacancy tax? Would the planning department manage that? Maybe that's a question for Mr. Rooker, I don't know. Can the city contemplate a vacancy tax to prevent somebody from purposely leaving property vacant because they're just in it for the investment quality, and even though it may affect the neighborhood? And is that a planning question or a legal question?
Michael Rooker, City Attorney for the City of Bloomington. If you might recall, the Home Rule Statute, one of the powers that's specifically withheld from localities is the power to levy a tax. Now, that turns out to be legally sometimes a very interesting question when something is dumped into the tax bucket or the fee bucket. Fees are permissible as long as they're reasonably related. So that's a really interesting question, one I've not thought about before or researched. So unfortunately, I have to tell you, I don't know.
If we were to contemplate it, would it be in Title 20, or would it go somewhere else?
That is also a fascinating question, and I'm not certain what the appropriate place
I'll
to
leave
put
it at that.
would be.
Thank you.
Councilmember Sandberg.
Perhaps a point of information, maybe legal can answer this, but when this has come up before with Hand on the issue of compliance with the 3-person occupancy, and when you have 3 people supposedly on the lease, but yet you've got 5 or 6 cars out, and I'm very familiar with this. These are the houses that are across the street from me. My understanding from talking to Hand staff is that if you go in and ask, whether you ask the landlord or you ask the tenants themselves, who's on the lease, and they'll say, well, only these 3 people, but there are maybe 2 other people that are living there, either as roommates, friends, significant others. If those other people have leases elsewhere, they are technically considered guests, and there's nothing that can be done. So I don't know where signing an affidavit would get at that issue, if that is the way enforcement has been stymied, if you will, by the over-occupancy. Anything from legal, or has anything changed in the Hand Department since last term when I was talking to Lisa Abbott about these kinds of things?
You know, it's difficult to get into specifics of individual cases like that when it comes to over-occupancy or Title 16 violations, potentially. So, I really don't, I hate to say I don't want to talk specifically about how that would work. We'd want to look on a case-by-case basis whether or not we had enough information based on information gathered by a hand inspector or planning and transportation or from a third party that we felt we had an over-occupancy that justified sending a notice of violation to somebody.
There just appear to be loopholes, which is adding to all the frustration from the residents about the over-occupancy issues, that in spite of our best efforts to regulate that and keep that under control, there are ways around that, and you still have the overabundance of cars in very limited space.
Like I said, we just have to try to evaluate on a case-by-case basis whether or not we think we have enough information to identify a violation. So.
Thank you.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
I wanted to follow up on Mr. Keppel's comment. Is there some flexibility in considering a conditional use? I mean, it's conditional, and we saw in your presentation, Mr. Robinson, some of the criteria that can be used when considering conditional use. But can you speak a little bit about the flexibility? I thought that you had to be pretty strict about saying, well, we can allow it because it meets this standard or this criteria.
So the BZA is kind of quasi-judicial, and they have to make their ruling based on the standards. So I think the question that was posed was, if a request met all the standards, they're not asking for any changes in the standards, they have to approve it. there are criteria that the BZA can weigh on those impacts to the community, consistency with the comprehensive plan, doesn't have adequate services. You know, there's several that are listed that they can consider as part of that decision-making process. You know, I believe that a lot of the, when we were talking about Chapter 3, there was some use-specific standards. I believe, you know, when we worked with Clarion and updating the code, we tried to identify as many standards to help make sure that we've addressed as many concerns as possible. And then anything that's remaining kind of falls into the conditional use category to help make sure there's that additional layer for consideration. But yeah, I don't know if
Yeah, and to follow up on that point too, I think that's a worthy point, Councilmember Piedmont Smith, because there is always a concern that on appeal there could be an accusation that the Board of Zoning Appeals or another body is acting in an arbitrary and capricious way and not treating like situations alike. So that's something we're very cognizant of in developing these standards and then advising our bodies as well.
So there is a certain amount of flexibility because one of the criteria are, does it meet the comp plan? And as we've seen, the comp plan is a long and complicated document that occasionally has internal discrepancies. So in that respect, would you say there's a bit of flexibility, even legally?
I think we could say that, but again, I think that every effort is made to be consistent within those bounds. So.
Does the BZA also consider precedent?
Yeah.
If there's a similar case, there was a case 2 years ago where this came up, and would they consider what the previous decision was? Or?
No, they're not a precedent-making body, no.
Okay. Thank you.
Further questions? Just to clarify, if the petition met all the criteria, planning criteria, could the BZA realistically deny the petition?
Again, I think if there was documentation on what the concerns were and issues raised by that process, they could. I mean, again, I think what we're looking for is consistency, and so generally based on the unique circumstance of that request, that's something that staff would look at, and again, that's something that the Board of Zoning Appeals would consider. Okay, seeing no other do you have a question, Councilmember Strabon?
The question is, are we going to have comments?
Yes, we will.
Oh, thanks.
In fact, we will now have comments. Do you have a comment?
I do.
Councilmember Strabon?
I do. So before ADUs were made a conditional use, no one had ADUs, accessory dwelling units. There are two right now going on in my neighborhood, and I've participated in the hearing at the BZA for one of them, and I've gone through a hearing officer for the other one, which I'm building. So council decided that ADUs would be legal. They're a conditional use. They're legal with conditions. So the first one went through the BZA right here. There was a neighbor who said, this is going to affect my parking, this is going to affect my tree. But the BZA said, this is a conditioned use, this is acceptable use. We are going to say, you can go ahead and build it. And the other one, which I'm doing, they came in and they either paid $100 or $200. Last time I was corrected, but maybe it was $200. They had a short meeting, and they sent out mail to everyone that was addressed by the planning department. And then we went to a hearing officer for about 20 minutes, and it's approved. So these are approved uses. And when I talked to Tim Miller, he said, council makes the decision that these are uses that are acceptable in the neighborhoods. So once council makes this decision that duplexes or triplexes are acceptable in the neighborhoods, on occasion, the conditional use could be turned down. I think 90%, approaching 90% of all conditional uses in the last 3 or 4 years have been approved. So it's essentially by right unless they can prove harm to an adjacent property. And that's a very specific criteria. And if someone thinks parking is harm, but the Board of Zoning Appeals members don't think parking is harm and that the community good and the comprehensive plan says that you should limit parking, that's their decision. So the 1 out of 10 chance in this 90%, 1 out of 10 chance where you might be able to show there's a negative impact is fairly slim. And these are all but by right. That's the point. So that's my comment. Thank you.
We're on council comment on Chapter 6. Anyone else care to make a comment? Councilmember Volin.
Yeah, this relentless attack on anything that might alter single-family housing is a mystery to me. I don't understand why Councilmember Sturbaum is so fixated on it. Cities grow and change. Cities grows and change, and they've grown and changed more slowly since we implemented code. I mean, there wasn't code to stop megaplexes from being built in Garden Hill and in Old Northeast and in Elm Heights, where I live, the places that I represent. Of course, those people in those neighborhoods deserve representation too, but some of them have committed to live in properties like this. But I mean, I've always taken the concerns of property owners seriously. If anything, we ought to be looking for ways to expand ownership of buildings that are not single-family use. But again, I keep thinking, how dramatic will be the change if we allow conditional use? I feel like there's a paranoia among people in these core neighborhoods that have been coming out at length that somehow the result of allowing even an inch is that developers will take a mile. But nothing in the new code or in the administrative aspects of Chapter 6 are going to allow a small wood to be built in the near west side. It's just not going to happen. There is talk of building plexes there, but these are 2 and 3 unit buildings that are the size of a regular house. I mean, all of a sudden I'm just sort of struck by the sheer, the sheer amount of force being brought by neighbors concerned about either their properties or more likely the prospect that they not be living next door to students, that I, even more now than ever, don't understand. It's mystifying to me why this much effort is being put into even allowing conditional uses here. I don't think that the sky is falling like Councilmember Sturbaum believes, and I don't understand why we're spending so much time worrying about these things. Thank you.
Further comment? Councilmember Chopra.
I think it's worth commenting and considering the idea of conditional use versus by right by thinking about how neighbors react with one another. And, this whole idea of having a conditional use where neighbors can voice their opinions and voice their concerns about their neighbors' use of their own property for something that, if it were conditional, the city is saying should be used in that way, might not be for the best of the community. And I just think it's something to consider. I'm just bringing it up as a thought, because oftentimes these types of hearings and these types of discussions become contentious and bring neighbors down. I have a neighbor who's taking over from their parents, don't live in their home anymore, and the kids are going to go into the home, and they're remodeling. And I noticed that they tore the whole deck down and started to build it up, and I thought, well, don't they need a permit for that? And started sort of stomping my feet a little bit, and I talked to the contractor, and he said, no, I don't think so. And I said, well, I think maybe. And he said, you know what? These people are going to be your neighbors real soon. I said, yeah, you're right. And I don't have a problem with the way that it ended up. The deck looks nice. So even if they needed to have a permit, it's not bothering me. It's not making my property any less valuable. It's not creating any problems for me, for them to have a deck that they enjoy. And so it's something to consider as far as how we live together in community. It's my suggestion that perhaps this whole conditional use versus by right might make community a little worse rather than better. Thank you.
Further comments? Councilmember Pimenez-Smith?
Yeah, just briefly, I do see that it's problematic to have conditional uses. I mean, as a community, we should decide, is this use appropriate or is this use not appropriate? Conditional use should really be left to things that are just an unusual use to begin with, that we didn't think of. I think conditional use makes it hard on property owners because they don't know, there's more steps to jump through. I'm commenting sort of on a philosophical level that, you know, it is divisive. It brings out neighbors. If, you know, neighbor A doesn't like neighbor B because their dog barks all night, then if neighbor B wants a conditional use, well, neighbor A is going to be there and say, no, this guy is such a pain, and I don't want to support whatever conditional use they're after. I mean, it's human nature, right? So I think just as a matter of good governance, it's best to really limit the conditional use process and just say, as a community, this is what we want, and this is what we don't want in those locations. So I need to reread this chapter. It's been a couple months since I've read it, so I'll be looking at that. But I think just as a principle of governance, conditional use is not a great idea. Thank you.
Further comment? First round? I'll make a comment that what Councilmember Sturbaum stated, the expectation that conditional use is allowed, I mean, the likelihood of it being granted is very high, and that conforms to my experience. And I'll leave it there. Councilmember Sturbaum, did you have an?
Yeah, I just wanted to speak up for the ADU, the accessory dwelling units, and I've long supported them, and I've supported them as a conditional use. And that's because when they go through a public review process, and they get done correctly. They don't just pop up and somebody didn't go through the process, and, oh, I thought it was by right. You know, and these are not contentious generally. And if somebody doesn't like their neighbor, the BZA does not care. This is a legal body, and the BZA says, you know, don't put it so close to your neighbor that you're breaking the rule. Well, I didn't look very carefully, so I put it 2 feet instead of 5, you know, and now I'm done, and too bad. But at the BZA, they go, no, you've drawn it 2 feet too close. You know, we have to fix it. It has to cover this much of the lot. So the conditional use is approving, but it's approving with conditions and with good review. So you occasionally get a neighbor who is annoying, who comes out and makes trouble, but the BZA is a legal body, and if they turn something down without legal findings, they would not be on the BZA very long, and they just do not do that. So I've been through a lot of that, and I don't always agree with their decisions, but they're mainly tougher and stricter than you imagine, and they are saying this is basically essentially by right. So council needs to make the same decision. Are we going to have plexus in the neighborhoods, or are we not? You know, conditional is better than non-conditional just because that's a better review process, but it does not, it is saying, as council, we approve these, period. Thanks.
We're on second round council comments on Chapter 6 of the UDO. Are there any others? Councilmember Volin.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the dispute around ADUs was should they be conditional or by right. I think that the remedy of going to the BZA is still there, whether it's conditional or not. If somebody sees that their neighbor is building an ADU and they're doing it improperly, I mean, they still have the ability to go to planning and check to see, is it being done right? And if somehow it's 2 feet close to the property line instead of 5 feet, then, you know, they can, the BZA should still hear it. They should still be able to lobby a protest. You know, that issue is really more, should ADUs be allowed by right in the first place? I don't know that the conditional, you know, the conditionality of it would make a difference with respect to, you know, whether it's being done properly. So it doesn't really address some of the reasons why ADUs were brought up in the first place. I mean, we're talking about an administrative chapter here, but I would think that that administrative option is still available to anybody who questions whether or not something was built properly, whether something's in violation or not. Maybe there's a situation where if it's already built that it won't be required to be torn down and moved, but I would think that that would be caught at the staff level. So I don't know. I think we're talking about 2 different issues here, and as far as the administrative one goes, you know, it doesn't depend on the conditionality of a given thing to check on the properness of a given project. Thank you.
Councilmember Sims.
Thank you. I think it's important to not let the different designations morph into where it's an unrecognizable glob. We either have no approval, conditional approval, or by right. 3 separate things. Okay, so, and I'm not saying this, I don't want to get into an argument with anyone, but to continually say, well, that is essentially, a conditional use is essentially by right. You see how that starts to get to where there's no distinction there? And that's what's confusing. I think they are very, very separate. Much like we, this body, cannot legislate morality, we can't legislate whether you're going to have a good neighbor or not, or whether they're going to be upset with you about you taking advantage of legal options to modify their property. What we need to be worried about or considering is the criteria that's set. Is that criteria met on that request for approval? And is that the criteria that the hearing officer and the planning and the BZA are following? I think those are it. Now, there's some other things. Yes, I'm concerned about parking. You know, we've got a parking challenge in this town. And if we build in my neighborhood 4 ADUs, what does that mean for on-street parking? And what are the criteria for parking on the property, which is limited anyway because it's on an existing property and you're putting a smaller unit on it? So you see, those are all the things, but we've set that criteria, I think. So there's a bunch of personal things we could say, well, we don't like this, my neighbor don't like that. But what does the law and the criteria based on the conditional approval say? And if they meet that, then I think we've done our job. Also, as long as there is an ability for their neighbors to participate and remonstrate and go through the hearing process. But no one should be able to stop me from doing something I'm legally allowed to do, and I meet the criteria because you don't want it. And that's where I'll leave that. Thank you.
Council comment, Councilmember Sturbaum.
Yes.
Does he have any time remaining?
This is the 3rd round.
Excuse me, Councilmember Sturbaum.
Anybody, okay.
Not arguing. I have a point that I forgot to make.
I believe, Councilmember Sherman, is that correct? We have only 2 rounds of questions, regardless of whether he has time remaining?
The press.
Only 2 rounds of questions? Okay. Comment, this is comment.
Later. Comment later. It's a good point.
Two bites of the apple, Mr. Chair.
Okay. So I have a second round comment just to say that I just want to emphasize that a conditional use, the likelihood of approval is very high. I don't know if it's 90%. I don't think I can say a simple number. It's probably some function, but it would be quite likely, more often than not, that certainly that it would be allowed, unless there are unless harm can be proved in some, demonstrable way. So if there are any other second round comments, Councilmember Sandberg? No? Okay, we will now move on to Chapter 7, pardon me.
Planning Transportation Director, is it possible for me to add a comment about conditional use, or should I wait until?
You have 30 minutes to make the presentation in Chapter 7. This would be a good opportunity for you to use it if you don't need that much time.
I just wanted to mention that it's a little misleading to think about conditional use being the same, almost the same as by right, because there is a high percentage of cases that go before the BZA with a conditional use that are approved. Ms. Scanlon mentioned this last week, that we believe that the main reason for that is because our staff is meeting with petitioners and potential petitioners daily. And if it's something that is just not going to be considered, we let them know. And so usually the cases that come forward, we think that they have merit, and so we encourage them to come forward to the BZA. So that interface that we have with the public daily adds to the increased percentage of conditional uses that are approved. That's all.
Thank you. Before we go on to Chapter 7, we were incorrect. Councilmember Sturbaum had 4 minutes. There is no stipulation about number of comments. He simply has 4 minutes per council member. So did he have time remaining? No. Councilmember Volin?
He had 2 bites the apple. He used at least 2 minutes in each one. We all used at least 2 minutes in our bites.
Okay. All right. So we will go on to Chapter 7. Mr. Robinson.
Thank you. This will be brief. I do want to follow up on Director Porter's comments, just for some clarification. The perception that even by right isn't a rubber stamp. Staff reviews requests daily and oftentimes give direction to people that they're not meeting the standards, and it often ends up leading to nothing. So I don't think it's a fair characterization to assume that just because it makes it to the hearing that it's a 90% approval. There are many instances that a sign permit, a pool permit, or what have you doesn't meet the standards. So just that clarity just needs to be specified. So Chapter 7, I really don't have a lot to say. This is a chapter with words and phrases used throughout the UDO. There's a reason why they're in there so that we have a definition. Chapter 1 does provide guidance on interpretation, so if there's something in there, how does that interpretation made? You want to reference back to Chapter 1. There are words and phrases that are not in Chapter 7. These are terminology that's widely accepted and used. I mentioned HUD and some affordability standards. Those would be instances that would fall under that category. I did highlight a few words that we've looked at very closely throughout this process. Student housing, fraternity, sorority, definition of family, and methadone and opioid facilities. So those are things that have kind of been through the ringer several times, looked at very closely throughout the process. And then I'm just going to close with my next slide to identify some unfinished business by staff that we hope council members will sponsor some amendments. I just have a list of some amendments that we're looking at. I have been working with a couple council members, but we do want to bring a new definition of fraternity and sorority to council for your consideration. There's been discussion about cooperative housing. We have a fix for that. Again, we'd like to include that, which would be in Chapter 3. There's some just minor clarifications on, what setbacks and including a designation for building, clarification on upper floor setbacks and how it fronts the street. The building height diagram in Chapter 7 could be clarified. Street light standards, there's a section in the downtown. We want to move that to the subdivision section. That's where it makes sense. Identified new plantings in evergreen species. There's a requirement for certain evergreen species, and we just want to clarify which species in the plant lists are actually evergreens. Change of use triggers. Currently, there's a trigger from, I believe, from residential to mixed use. We just want to add another trigger so when there's a change of use, when does site compliance come into play. Better idea on how to deal with corner lots and which is the primary street. Again, I mentioned a little bit about the variance process with existing setbacks. Again, we're trying to minimize or clarify that with existing structures, we'd like to maintain those setbacks. Minor clarification on fire hydrants and giving the ability to the fire chief to locate where those should go. Use variance, since it's on Halloween Eve, I'd like to equate this to kind of a Harry Potter theme on, we're trying to get the scar removed. This is a process we have right now. It's very questionable. Clarion's advised us that we don't use it. It's not a practice used throughout the country. It is highly debatable. It was removed throughout the process, but it still remains in the variance section, so we want to clean that up and remove the use variance process. It's not a conditional use. And then universal design, again, I mentioned at the beginning, there's desire to include some universal design, and we do have a draft amendment we're considering. The important things with that one is to think about the triggers for that compliance. We're looking at either the number of lots in subdivision or the number of units, and then a percentage of those units that would have to comply with a menu of universal design standards such as doorway widths, steps, and those sorts of things. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention, and I'd be happy to answer questions for Chapter 7. Thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I have a request. There were 4 definitions that Mr. Robinson had up there. Well, the words were up there, yes. Could I request that he actually talk about all 4 of those? Rather than, they had 30 minutes and they took 5 minutes, and rather than taking up our question time?
I think that's a good idea, because if there's, without objection, because I have questions related to those, and maybe we could clarify from the onset. So, Mr. Robinson, could you go into a little detail on those 4 defined words or phrases?
I will try to do my best. I don't have the definitions memorized. I'll try to highlight some of the issues around those definitions. So student housing, as you know, is a new definition that was introduced to deal with the student housing issues that we're dealing with. One of the things that we've been coordinating with student housing has been related to Indiana University and the definition of sorority and fraternity. So those have an interplay with one another, as well as cooperative housing. If you read the definition of fraternity and sorority, a cooperative housing arrangement could be interpreted as, so that's things that we've looked at in those definitions on how to deal with that. Again, working with Indiana University with fraternity and sorority, we're trying to coordinate with them on concerns that they've raised about unsanctioned or sanctioned fraternities and sororities. As you know, we've had some enforcement cases of some, off-campus fraternities, so we're coordinating with that. Definition of family, we're not changing the 3-person rule, but Plan Commission wanted to expand kind of the modern concept of what a family is to be more inclusive. And then the opioid epidemic, this is an issue that we've been dealing with, and we needed to make sure that those definitions were appropriate to address that. So those are new, or looking at those requirements on those standards. And one of the key things, the difference between methadone and opioid, Methadone facilities are highly regulated by the state. That's something that we don't have regulatory control over because of the distribution or administration of methadone. Opioid treatment facilities use other things, so they're not as highly regulated, so that's why there's a differentiation between the two, as I understand. So I think I've characterized that without getting into the weeds or the specifics of those definitions, but that's why I highlighted them and tried to identify some of the issues. Again, be happy to answer some questions. Did that help at least identify why I pointed those out?
I wanted more weeds, but, you know,
We have lots of time.
nobody quote me on that. I don't want the plural to be left out of that.
I will say that we've had pretty thorough legal review, that some of these things we do have to be very cognizant of, fair housing regulations, and other legal standards that we have to be cognizant of. So there's been a lot of coordination with lawyers involved, and so I just want to say there's been a lot of effort behind the scene to make sure that these definitions, as well as others, have kind of passed the legal test.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. So we'll proceed now to questions. And Councilmember Volin, did you want to begin?
Yeah, so I'd like to dig into this a little bit. First of all, we talked about fraternity and sorority. Do they relate to co-housing? In other words, isn't it a kind of specialty co-housing? If a fraternity, if there's a group of IU students that are unsanctioned, can they co-house?
That's the challenge with the definition now. So a co-housing group could be defined as a fraternity or sorority, and so that's one of the considerations.
Except if they're not enrolled at IU.
Right.
And who oversees that? Mr. Rooker has answers, I think.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here. I don't know how well any of you know this, but there's currently an ongoing case that we're involved in regarding the UDO, the expiring UDO's definition of fraternity and sorority. And it's related to how much...
Is that the one on Atwater?
Yeah, no, it's
Okay.
related to a case on fraternity on Fee Lane.
Okay.
So part of the challenge here is to try to create a definition that doesn't raise the concerns that have been brought up in that litigation, but still provides a certain modicum of oversight to the university for these bodies, because the challenges that are presented by unsanctioned or unrecognized Greek organizations tend to be considerable compared to those where there is some level of university oversight. So.
But I mean, we did have the issue of the would-be fraternity on Atwater, where they took up 2 houses, and as far as I know, it's still in litigation. They still haven't complied with whatever existing rules we have.
Yeah. And that's a different enforcement action. That was an area that was we had a boarding house there, a lawful non-conforming use at that site, not a fraternity or sorority. It wasn't in the institutional district where fraternity or sorority use is permitted. So that's a different enforcement action.
So by sort of
And it's
creating
ongoing.
this definition, aren't we effectively expanding the boundaries of the campus, or specifically where IU has jurisdiction over what's essentially a city planning issue, if there's a fraternity that's not connected to the campus? I mean, is this defined by the university owning the land underneath it?
No. Again, fraternities and sororities are only uses in certain districts. I don't have memorized which districts you can have a fraternity or sorority use in. I don't know if somebody can look that up. But in those zoning districts where they're not, permitted as by right or conditional uses, you couldn't put one there. So.
Okay, well, I mean, just for what it's worth, like, I'm still concerned about whether that definition might actually extend a jurisdictional courtesy to IU that's not returned complimentarily. We'll bring it up later. Thank you.
Councilmember Piedmont-Smith.
Yes, for the benefit of the public, I would like Mr. Robinson to go into some more detail as to what has changed in the definition of family from our previous UDO, and what has remained the same. Because I think there's a lot of confusion, and we do use family a lot, when we talk about homes and who's allowed to live there.
The best explanation, if you look on the Plan Commission site, there was an amendment that dealt with the changes. I apologize, I don't have the definition memorized on what changed. It just expanded maybe from what the current UDO has a more traditional concept of what a family is versus a more modern day concept of family. That's the only thing that expanded in the definition of family. So a more traditional interpretation would be a husband and a wife and a close relative, and the current UDO expands that definition of family that would allow adopted children and grandparents and other relatives, so to speak. So that's what it expanded. But there's a amendment that I can forward to the council that highlights the difference in that. Sorry, I don't have that memorized. I've processed a lot of changes throughout this process, so.
I understand. I will use my comment time to just do that as a PSA announcement. Thank you.
Councilmember Sandberg.
Definition of family being challenged because of the fact that, the nuclear family that we once, was fairly much the norm of a mom and a dad and kids and 2.5 dogs and cats, is being challenged by the economic realities that sometimes people have to pool their resources as, friends, and then we're kind of getting into the other issue that we're having with the definition of cooperative housing and co-housing. I mean, is it just kind of mix and mingling with the changing norms of people wanting to live together to share economic resources?
Yeah, that's a good point, and I would agree that that's addressing the realities of today's world. There is a expansion for seniors over the age of 55 that, allows more of them to cohabitate so that they're not, capped by the 3-person rule. So again, I think it's recognizing some of the housing and economic realities of how people choose to live and who their family members are.
Thank you.
Councilmember Sturbaum.
Yeah, just on the same subject, on changes to the definition of family from Amendment 18. Number 6 was, in all other zoning districts, meaning not in single-family zoning districts, family also includes a group of no more than 5 adults and their dependent children living together as a single housekeeping unit in a dwelling unit. Where does that apply? Like, it doesn't apply in single family, so where would 5 adults and their dependent children be living together in a dwelling unit? I'm just trying to picture what that means.
I'll have to look at the specifics of that, but again, I think you have to go back to the use table, kind of what Council Mike Rucker said about institutional uses. Those are only allowed in 2, so when you're looking at multifamily units and which districts those are, when you start playing into the definition of student housing, that has an impact on that as well. So I'd have to look at that chapter to get back with you.
I don't know what it means either. Thanks.
Yeah.
Further questions on Chapter 7? Is it first round? Okay. Second round, Councilmember Volin.
Could I have the slide back up? Okay, so can you go to the next slide? There was, I know that you don't have the definitions in front of you, but how is cooperative housing, is the only difference between cooperative housing and a fraternity that the occupational status of the people living in it?
One of the things that we considered was either a definition or a use-specific standard. Again, because of the definitions of...
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing.
Again, because of the definitions of cooperative housing and ownership, that kind of complicates things because you start getting into regulating ownership, and that's something we want to avoid with cooperative housing and fraternities. So Chapter 3, we'll be looking at a use specific guideline on cooperative housing and not a definition per se.
Mr. Grulich, do you have something to contribute, or? I thought you came up to answer the question. Okay. Maybe Mr. Rooker has something to.
So again, it's been a balancing act between the definition and where to put the cooperative housing, and we believe we have a good fix to deal with that, as opposed to relying on the use variance process, which is currently how we've been dealing with the cooperative housing, is going through a use variance process.
Okay. You know, I'd echo what Scott is saying. I think the answer is no. That's not the only difference between those two types of housing. I think you'll see that when the amendments come forward, presuming that they're sponsored. But cooperative housing is a form of ownership where typically you own shares in a corporation that owns a particular property. A fraternity or sorority is an entity that's affiliated with an institution of higher learning. So,
in theory.
No, I think by definition, right, a fraternity or a sorority that's not affiliated with an institution of higher learning is something altogether different, so.
Well, that's why I was asking the question about co-housing, but that gives me to the bigger question, which is are there no qualms in the administration about the, student is a noun that determines occupation. To have a separate zoning type for student housing, does that not give you any qualms at all? I mean, to me, it says that they have a different status, they're separate from the rest of the community, they're not part of the community, and we're housing them in a separate, different way.
I don't think that I'm the appropriate person to answer that question.
So again, I think I would disagree with that assumption. First of all, they're not a protected class. Second of all, student housing is permitted in virtually every district, but what we're distinguishing is the large student developments, and that's the differentiation between, what I would call student housing, which is allowed anywhere. It doesn't matter what type of rental unit or ownership unit it is, but when you are defined as a student housing, that gets into the much larger complexes that we're looking at, and that has a proposed zoning district. But student housing is permitted in many areas throughout the community, so no.
Thank you.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yes, I just noticed that there's a definition here called dwelling, short-term rental. The rental of an entire dwelling unit for monetary consideration for a period of time less than 30 consecutive days. But I don't find that anywhere else in the UDO. And I suppose it's referring to Airbnb type arrangements, but I don't see that on the use table or anywhere else. Can you explain why that's in there and what it means?
Yep, so that is in there so that we make it clear that that is a defined use, and you are correct, it is not a permitted use anywhere, and that is very deliberate. So a short-term rental, by this definition, is where you are leasing the entire house for a prolonged period of time. So the county deals with this as vacation rental houses. You rent a house for a weekend, but this is different than an Airbnb where you're just renting a bedroom or a few bedrooms in a house. This is a vacation home where you rent it for a very lengthy period of time. So we have a definition so that it is not an oversight. It's just, simply I would say, think of a slaughterhouse. We don't have a definition, but it's not a permitted use. So you could say, well, you're excluding it from your list of permitted uses, so you have to make an interpretation whether or not this is allowed. No, this was very purposefully excluded, and so there's a definition that deals with that.
Okay, so the definition is there so that people can't wrangle their way in and say, well, it's not defined, so it's actually falls under something else.
Exactly.
Okay. And then what about like Airbnbs that are part of somebody's home, that somebody lives there and also rents out an extra bedroom?
So we are not regulating those any differently than current, meaning they're still allowed. They're not differentiated as separate land use. It's still a single family dwelling unit.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Ruff.
The definition, the general definition of development is very much points specifically to the idea of sort of physical development of land or development of projects. And in all other contexts in the document, except for where it refers to floodplain. So is there no place in the document, no need to differentiate sort of more community development or sort of qualitative development? The comp plan, we made an effort to really clearly differentiate or make sure that development in terms of physical growth of the community was value neutral and as separate from what we might think of as developing opportunity and potential of the community in other ways. So there's no reason anywhere in the actual UDO for us to talk about defining that other kind of development, sort of more community development?
Yeah, so this is more of a regulatory effort. So when we use language in the code that deals with no development is allowed within a karst conservation easement, this is what we're talking about. You can't place a sidewalk, you can't, do X, Y, and Z. So this is more of a regulatory approach, not a general, hey, we encourage development in this corridor of the area or this corridor of the city, but more of, what is development? Is it placement of a sidewalk? Is it construction of a building? So that when we use the word development, we've got something to point to that says, no, you're constructing a sidewalk, that's development, it's not allowed within this karst conservation easement, or something to that effect.
Thank you, that clarifies it for me. I was just, I can't claim to have gone over every single, sentence in the entire UDO, and I didn't know whether there might be somewhere, or some reference, or some concept included in there that we might want to clarify that there's another meaning for development in this document. But if there's nothing in there that refers to that, then that's fine. That's what I wanted to confirm. Thank you.
Councilmember Sturbaum.
Yeah, the Airbnb is interesting because I think the state precludes us from regulating them. Isn't that right? What about occupancy when people rent a house for a weekend to 12 partiers who are down for the football game? That's going beyond occupancy regulations for a single-family neighborhood? Is it just, do we have no control over that? Because I knew someone who actually moved from my neighborhood because that was pretty much of a regular occurrence. So when they're over-occupying a property on a weekend as a rental, can we enforce that simply as occupancy?
So that's two different approaches to occupancy. Occupancy from the definition of family that we were just talking about deals with how many people live there, how many people are on a lease. You're talking about how many people are physically in a building at one time.
Well, you rent to them instead of for a year, you're renting to them for a weekend. So you're renting to 12 people, but you're only renting to them for 2 days. Can we regulate that as a rental? Or do we just go, we can't do anything, sorry?
Yeah, so your question there of, they rent it out for a weekend, that's in that fuzzy gray area of, Airbnb versus our definition that we were just talking about of a short-term rental. So the occupancy for the zoning district is going to say how many people can live there on a lease. There's nothing that we've got right now, unless I'm missing something.
So is there an amendment that we could do that would address that problem? I would like to make one if we have it. Maybe we can talk together about what would be the language, because it's clearly violating the occupancy of a neighborhood. And sometimes it's rented as a party house for the weekend by other groups.
Sorry, Scott. Yeah.
I believe it's probably best to leave that outside of the UDO. I don't think that's something that's within the UDO. I'd want to check with legal staff and whatnot, but again, you are correct, and the state did limit our ability to regulate short-term rentals. We don't regulate occupants per se in single-family houses if they're all a family. So I'm just sitting here thinking of a, scenario of I invite friends over, or my daughter has a slumber party. Are they going to violate occupancy? I think we just got to be careful on how we do that. We do have tools to deal with nuisance and noise, and that's probably the best tool that we have right now, but I think that's probably worth a conversation to consider something above that.
Thank you.
Councilmember Volin.
Yeah, I think Councilmember Sturbaum brings up an interesting point that at least we have two different sort of scopes of occupancy that may confuse people. There's the, fire occupancy, and then there's the long-term occupancy. I wonder if there's, would staff see a problem with coming up with sort of a more targeted phrase to distinguish those two things so that it's easier to talk about those issues when they come up, even if we can't regulate Airbnb occupancy? Do you see what I'm asking?
I think we can certainly look into it, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Okay, seeing none, then we'll go to the public. If you'd like to comment on Chapter 7, definitions, please step forward. Seeing none, we're back to council for final comments on this chapter. If you would like to make general comments about the UDO, I suggest that we wait until consideration of written objections. There will be a time for council comment on the UDO as a whole at that time. Councilmember Sturbaum, do you have a comment on Chapter 7?
I wondered if I could use any time to make my comments on conditional use, or if that is out of order here.
Yeah, I think we should wait. This is Chapter 7.
You'll hear it later.
Questions or comments? Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Sure, it's okay.
Yes, I would just like to read the new definition of family, because I think there are some interesting changes here, but I also want to read it because there's a fear out there that somehow we're going to get 17 people as a family. So family is defined as an individual or group of persons that meets at least one of the following definitions. Number one, an individual or a group of people, all of whom are related to each other by blood, marriage, or legal adoption, foster parent responsibility, or other legal status, making the person a dependent of one or more persons legally residing in the household under federal or state law. Okay, so that's a family, but it's a looser definition of adoption, foster parenting, et cetera. Number two, a group of no more than 5 adults aged 55 years of age or older living together as a single housekeeping unit in a dwelling unit. It's a little redundant, but I like that. So that's, as people age, and especially if they're retired, their income is restricted, and this is a way to have an affordable household and to kind of pick your family, your people you feel like you can live with, and I like this addition to the definition. Number three, a group of people whose right to live together is protected by the Federal Fair Housing Act amendments of 1988 and/or the Bloomington Human Rights Ordinance as amended and interpreted by the courts, including but not limited to persons that are pregnant. I'm not sure of all the intricacies of this, but I think group homes would fall under this definition. Maybe some residential treatment, small group home treatment centers. So some kind of supported living environment, which I think we want to allow, of course. And now this is important. So in the RE, R1, R2, R3, and R4 zoning districts, so this is mainly the single-family districts, and in single-family residential portions of planned unit developments, a group of no more than 3 adults and their dependent children living together as a single housekeeping unit or a combination of a single-family dwelling unit and an accessory dwelling unit. So this is not increasing the number of related people, or I'm sorry, not increasing the number of non-related people who can live in a so-called single-family home. So that is staying the same. Number 5, in all other zoning districts, family also includes a group of no more than 5 adults and their dependent children living together as a single housekeeping unit. So here, Councilmember Sturbaum was wondering why this was in here. I assume it applies to multifamily districts, and it could apply to student housing. It could apply to cooperative housing. I do hope that we get a definition of cooperative housing that makes it allowed in single-family districts. But for now, they would be allowed under this category in districts that are not single-family. So I think there are situations where you have more than, if you have, that you have 4 or 5 unrelated adults that live together. So anyway, I just want to review that for the public's benefit. I think it's a important definition because in a lot of the earlier parts of this code, it refers to single-family zoning. And so this is what we're talking about. Thank you.
Councilmember Volin?
Yeah, I want to do the same thing for student housing or dormitory that Councilmember Piedmont Smith did with family. I'm going to read the definition. A multiple family dwelling designed primarily as housing for or likely to be occupied by unmarried undergraduate or postgraduate students, including but not limited to, 1, multiple family dwellings that contain any living units with 4 or more bedrooms, or 2, multiple family dwellings where more than 33% of the living units contain 3 bedrooms, or 3, residential buildings that do not meet the definition of a residential rooming house or hotel or motel, in which any of the bedrooms require the use of a common hallway shared by more than 3 bedrooms to access the nearest bathroom facilities or to access a cooking area containing a built-in sink, refrigerator, and stove or oven. For purposes of determining whether a multiple family dwelling meets this definition, the city may consider the degree to which the facility is occupied by undergraduate or postgraduate students and the degree to which occupancy is marketed to undergraduate or postgraduate students. This use does not include a fraternity or sorority. There are a lot of problems with a definition like this. First of all, it lumps graduate students and undergraduates together. They're different use cases. Graduate students tend to live in properties for longer periods of time. Undergraduates, if they are moving every year, are often doing so because if they don't, because they have to determine where they're going to live next year almost 10, 11 months before they have to move, because they often are not here in the summertime. I'm not sure it's their choice that they want to be as itinerant as they are. It's that that's the nature of the housing market in a town like this. But the 3 bullet points here, of the 3 bullet points, only the 3rd one, residential buildings that do not meet rooming house or hotel definition, that's the common idea that we have of a dormitory. But multiple family dwellings that contain any living units with 4 or more bedrooms, that's considered student housing. I mean, how many 5-bedroom units or 10-bedroom units are there in town that are, that may not have a majority of students? I mean, overall, all this does is it creates a separation of class. It assumes that all students are it's not desirable to live near students or have students in your building if you're a non-student. It certainly does not encourage us to find a way to integrate the student population into the city without separating them in units in particular areas of town. One thing that I may concede, because I have been on record as saying that I oppose absolutely the student housing definition, but you look at it in the EDO, it specifically says mixed-use student housing, and as staff said, it's specifically about large buildings targeted to students. I accept that there are buildings like that. We often call them dormitories even when they're not. And, we ought to have a definition for that. It's the title that's the issue. It's the assumption that somehow all students are the same and that students need to be, I just don't even, they're people. Last I checked, they were people. They have behaviors that are different than your typical non-student. But it's a short step from student to kid. Well, I don't want to live next to college kids. Last I checked, they were 18 and they can vote. And I've said this countless times, and I'll keep saying it, because it's a lesson that we have yet to integrate in the city. I don't care what percentage they are of the city. If we don't start treating them like adults, if we don't assume that they are adults that they are, then we're going to have negative consequences as a result. I don't have enough time to go into that kind of detail, but I'm looking at this definition and the definition of mixed-use student housing to make sure that at least in our rhetoric that we don't infantilize students, so we don't continue infantilizing students like campuses have a tendency of doing in the first place. Thank you.
Further comment on Chapter 7? Okay. Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Robinson. Thank you, Mr. Garlick. That concludes our introduction to the proposed Unified Development Ordinance. We will now go to consideration of written objections per Indiana Code 3674606C3. I'd like to make an announcement that the council's taking up these considerations of written objections now. The council has a packet of written objections filed before the meeting, which were handed out before the meeting and are available to the public. If you'd like a copy, you can approach the clerk, has copies. And if you're a member of the public wishing to file one this evening, please do so with the city clerk, either before or after you speak. And please raise your hand if you wish to speak in regard to a written objection. Anyone would like to speak? One, two people? Three people? Okay. So I see there are 3 people and who wish to speak about written objections. Council will now hear from them. Each speaker may speak for no more than 3 minutes. So please approach the podium and state your name and sign in, please. You have 3 minutes.
I'm Elizabeth Cox-Ash, and I want to address something. I mean, one of the things that the public is so concerned about with this UDO is it involves their homes. This is most people's largest investment. So anything that affects their largest investment of their entire lives, they're going to feel very threatened about it. As a result, in some of these hearings, I have seen gestures, I've heard leading comments. There's kind of a nastiness about this whole discussion about the UDO. In 2003, Bloomington adopted the Safe and Civil City. And I was so proud of Bloomington for adopting that. This kept, I hoped, conversations from being nasty. One of the biggest elephants in the room is what has happened to our local farmers market and how I think it has been permanently changed. Anytime you go, you hear the yelling back and forth of complaints against a vendor or vendor friends shouting back and forth. I'll tell you, I don't feel safe at that farmer's market. I really don't. And I don't know how we can ever go back to what it was before. I have a neighbor across the street who has a toddler and an infant, and he has said he's afraid to take his family to the farmer's market. This nastiness has gone all along, even with gestures or anything else. I just would hope everyone would be safe and civil and polite, and any comments made, please do it. Please be nice. Don't be nasty. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
My name is Michelle Henderson. According to a front-page article in the Herald Times on October 21st, 2019, the city is paying Nebraska-based RDG Planning and Design $41,000 for a housing study. The team has already found a relatively high vacancy rate of 9.5%, which doesn't indicate a housing shortage or crisis. So why destroy the affordable housing that still exists in the core neighborhoods? Replacing old houses with plexes will damage our local environment by sending tons of debris to our landfills, releasing toxic waste like asbestos dust, and causing the destruction of old-growth trees and wildlife habitat. Voting to make the plexes conditional will have the same effect as by right. Please understand that. The real estate investment firms who will be demolishing small houses to build larger, more expensive housing will gladly pay the fines due to their profit margin. Replacing small, older houses with more expensive housing will be devastating to low-income residents who will be evicted by landlords who went to sell their rental properties to developers. I have 2 empty houses on my street because the landlords would not renew the leases. One was an elderly couple who had lived there 20 years. One was a single mother. Those houses are now empty. They're waiting to see what's going to happen with this UDO. That is a fact. It's right there on my street. I am requesting an amendment that removes the core neighborhoods from upzoning in order to protect the low-income residents who live there, as well as the unique green space only found in our older neighborhoods. Please do what is in the best interest of the residents who live in our residential core neighborhoods and vote no to replacing the zoning ordinance from single-family to multifamily. Please don't vote in the interest of wealthy real estate developers over our low-income residents. This is not the way to help the most vulnerable citizens you were elected to serve. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
Good evening, I'm Patrick Murray. This is regarding Chapter 4, and I'm speaking against changing the UDO to allow 3 and 4 unit multiplexes in the core neighborhoods. So I have a few observations to go along with that. Some of these are questions. Does Bloomington have a housing density problem? I don't know. But it does have a housing cost problem. Are these the same, or are they different issues? Will adding more housing lower the price of housing across the board? Have we conflated density with affordability? Will increased housing density create more housing affordable to the missing middle and below? Housing density and housing affordability are 2 different issues that require different solutions. There is an urge to copy what other communities are doing. Are our problems the same as theirs? Do we know all the facts? Should we adopt their solutions without an understanding of what their situation is and understand if it's working or not? There is an urge to do what other communities are doing. Will that work in Bloomington? In Prospect Hill, we've been adding density little by little for a long time. It's been an organic process, taking what we have and altering, renovating it, amending it, adding to it to create additional units. A house becomes a little duplex on the same footprint with a few bedrooms each. Nobody notices. It's not a big change. It fits in. Someone creates an ADU behind their house down the alley. Walk around our neighborhood and you'll find a dozen, maybe more, tucked away in the neighborhood. They fit in. A little more density. We subdivide long lots for tiny houses. There was a project on Maple Street several years ago that did that. We worked with Life Designs and another organization to create an affordable apartment building on the edge of the neighborhood on an unused site that used to be a church, and then it was an unused commercial building. That was on West 3rd Street. We have addressed individual sites with individual solutions. It's a process that works and has neighborhood consensus. I think we need to have a process that works for the neighborhoods and the need for more housing, for rental and home ownership. We already have a system that works. Let's fine-tune that, tweak it a bit to make it more user-friendly. Prospect Hill is a real neighborhood with homeowners and renters, people of all ages, families of all sizes, growing families with children and empty nesters, people of many colors and languages. We have houses of many sizes and many price ranges. I've seen renters become homeowners. I've seen widows downsize and new families move in next door to me. It's an organic process that works. Prospect Hill is not broken. It is not an obsolete paradigm. Let's value and protect our core neighborhoods. Let's capitalize on what we do well and what works here. We are a community of intelligent, resourceful, inventive people. Let's create a Bloomington solution, not a Portland or Seattle solution.
Thank you for your comments. Yes, I'll allow others if they want to step up and comment.
Members of the council, my name is David Keppel. I did not file any written objection because I have no objection to the UDO as it was recommended to the Plan Commission. But I do want to thank members of the public and all members of the council for very hard work and for what, for me, has been a thoroughly enlightening and educational experience, which has changed my previous views. While I remain deeply committed to higher density, I urge the Commission in this weekend, when you have to file amendments, to think creatively about amendments narrower than blocking, because I don't think that's necessary, but that would address the real issues that members of the public have expressed concern about. And I believe that I don't want to go into detail here, there isn't time, but I believe that you will find amendments that would greatly reduce the risks that have been discussed while allowing what the last speaker called an organic increase in density, including duplexes and triplexes. So I urge you to look for those amendments, to think what those amendments would be, and to find a way to address the twin need for, triple need, affordable housing, greater sustainability in an age of climate crisis, and respect for all our residents and all the hard work they've put to make Bloomington what it is. And I think you can find that way forward. I think after all the division, we can go forward in surprising unity with a little creativity, and much respect and thanks to all.
Thank you.
My name is Wendy Brisht. I spoke a while back. I was listening in today to the meeting, and it seems to me that there isn't a good understanding of what it's like to live close to the university and know the threat of the encroaching student housing. I think the desperation that people are expressing is because they have been there before. I shared last time what it was like in the 1970s, and the neighborhood went downhill so fast it took your breath away. It was systematic. In just a few years, half of Elm Heights was gone, and the only thing that stopped it stopped just about at our block. The only thing that stopped it was the reinstatement of the occupancy limits. Otherwise, and the other thing that stopped it was that at that time, student rents were cheap and investors were not willing to pay the big bucks for the houses that were very close to campus that were expensive. But even after that was a battle to reinstate that. But even after that was done, it took a long time because there were still big enclaves of students, and I know some very nice students, but the ones that live near campus in groups are almost all undergraduates, and they can be very nice, and they can be wild animals. And the ones that were near us were wild animals. And we had a lot of trouble. It was very uneasy time for a very long time. We didn't feel safe. We didn't allow children to walk alone. We were just uncomfortable. Students are different when they're spread out and mixed in with the community than when they're in groups. And the difference between 3 students in a house on a lot or up to 18 students per lot in a triplex is huge. Let's see. I've just from my own experience, we had a drug house kitty corner to us on First and Woodlawn. There was, and still is occasionally, partying, yelling, profanity, drunkenness, fights. These are not things that families and retirees can withstand. not on a regular basis. They just can't. It just doesn't work. I think, I think we've been there. We've done it. We've seen what happens almost instantly when the protections of the neighborhoods close to the university are lifted. And to ignore that is to repeat it. And I think the rest, there's no way to take it back. There's no way to get back the neighborhoods that are now student housing. And to lose the rest of it will be lost forever. I think we're just very vulnerable because we're so close to the neighborhood. I never thought our neighborhood would recover. I never wanted to live there.
Excuse me, so your
yes.
time is expired? Could you conclude
Yes.
in a sentence or so?
Yes. I would urge you to try to maybe introduce something that could protect us from the certainty of the takeover by the student rental units that are close to the university. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, other comment from the public on written objections? Seeing none, we're back to council, and we have an opportunity for questions for staff or comments. So let's go to questions. Are there any questions? Okay, we'll go to comments then. Councilmember Sturbaum, you can begin.
Yeah. I'm not a debater, and I'm not playing any games. I really am trying to tell the truth as I understand it. The story about what happened at the Plan Commission when conditional use was being debated between ADUs and by right ADUs, and the planning department said, oh, there were only 12 or 10 that came through, and they were implying that the conditional use process had slowed or stopped those ADUs from happening. When I actually asked how many were turned down in the ADU process, the answer was 0. The actual problem was that they did not fit the lots. They didn't fit the lots, period. And this talk of, we straightened everything out before, and that's why they all went through. I get permits all the time. By right has to meet setbacks. By right has to meet regulations. And so do these ADUs. So there was nothing in the conditional use process that obstructed the ADUs from happening. There was simply inconsistent language drafted for the criteria. So I just wanted to say that because that is what I understand to be true. I also understand this, that, in the 70s, we were just talking about the history of this city. Anti-war action on this campus was going on, and the city was the first city really to turn over as a Democratic city from a Republican city. And Frank McCloskey came in and made all kinds of changes. One of the changes, he was an idealist and he wanted to fix everything. One of the changes he made, and the word that one of his planners used was egalitarian. They upzoned to 5 unrelated. And they thought this was going to be a very good change for everyone in the city. And it unleashed this speculation on the city and this devastation of neighborhoods that no one expected, but they should have in a college town. And it took, Tim Miller was the planner for all those 12 years, and his career was kind of getting the genie back in the bottle. And the end of Tommy Allison's mayorship, there were signs like, it wasn't exactly lynch Tim Miller, but there was a big billboard that was against Tim and against Tommy for doing all this, because the downzoning was going to cost investors money. And she decided not to run again right at that time when the vote came for, are we going to downzone? So the downzoning happened right after she was not running. And Tim Miller was then let go by the next mayor. And he thinks, well, somebody said planners have an expiration date. He took a lot of heat for what happened, and a new planner came in. But we've seen it. We've seen it happen. And it takes time. It took time for that to devastate these neighborhoods. And the single-family zoning that was enacted to save the neighborhoods. We've been called racist. We've been called We don't want poor people in our neighborhoods. We've been called all kinds of things, but that isn't what happened in Bloomington. That wasn't what took place. And the fact that we've seen it before, and the very well-meaning people are saying, let's try it again. And we're saying there are places to put this density. These neighborhoods are valuable, and all these polls said, like, people want little houses. They want single-family houses. And to devastate and remove those from our stock when it isn't necessary by careless downzoning without understanding the unintended consequences, that's why people are coming out. And I have one last thing to say. The statistics on people who have talked to us, the written comments, 38-2 agree with me. The Elm Heights meeting that was announced, 70-1, they voted in favor of not adding plexes.
Councilmember Serban.
And public comments were 35-4, not adding plexes.
That will have to conclude your comment.
Against, and I am
So
done.
we'll move on to further council comment. Anyone like to comment? Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yeah, I just want to say this whole process has been very difficult for me, and I think for most of us sitting up here, for various reasons. The research that is out there studying the effects of upzoning, there is research on both sides. There's some that says this creates filtering and leads to affordable housing. There's some that says no, upzoning doesn't lead to affordable housing. So there are research scholars with PhDs who have found opposite results of this, and none of the communities they study is like Bloomington. They're all studying big cities, mostly out in California. So it's very difficult to make data-driven decisions in this case because there are no studies of equivalent communities out there, and the studies that do exist, I have read more studies that say upzoning is a good thing in the long term, but I know there are studies out there that contradict that, so it's very difficult to know what to do. I agree with Councilmember Sturbaum that certainly I have received a lot more public comment against allowing plexes in single-family neighborhoods than I have received in favor of it. I also, as people know, I think climate change is the most important issue facing society today, and the city is not excluded. I think the city needs to do everything possible to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and I think greater density close to where people work, play, and study is an important part of that. Another complication in this issue is that KONA, which is an organization that I have long respected, came out with a mailer with basically false information, and also didn't apparently follow their own bylaws in approving their stance on this issue. And they are a nonprofit organization, which is not supposed to be doing lobbying, and I feel like their mailer was lobbying. So there are many unfortunate outcomes in this whole process in that I've lost the faith that I had in KONA as a body with great integrity, which is very unfortunate because they could speak for as a democratic voice, to help us up here understand issues, but now I believe they have been compromised by this. It's also unfortunate because it's become very bitter, as as Ms. Cox-Ash pointed out, it's become very uncivil. People have accused me of being a liar, accused me of being like President Trump in this, and really what I've just tried to do is listen. I always take notes, and weigh the two sides. And I am not a cheerleader for either side. As people know, I have been leaning towards allowing the plexes, but I have not made up my mind, and I really appreciate the comments of Mr. Keppel in that I do hope that we can address the greatest concerns, and maybe not this year, but eventually maybe we can lead to greater density. I think it is unfortunate that the housing study the city has commissioned is not completed. The timing is poor in that respect. So I just wanted to relay that to convey my sincerity in this effort, and that I will continue to study it carefully. Thank you.
Councilmember Sandberg.
Thank you. Throughout this entire discussion, obviously, we are dealing with a lot of what I like to call academic politics, where people can kind of get very entrenched very early on, depending on who they've read, where they've gotten their research, and then they develop their own confirmation bias. And so what I have tried to do, as I have carefully and thoughtfully listened to all sides, is to try to see, how does this make sense in Bloomington, which is the city I know, the city I love, where there has been a lot of history of the threats and the vulnerability that many of the long-term residents are talking about when they have experienced the encroachments from the university. And they've seen how that has impacted the quality of their life in a very negative way. And then we've been through the whole politics of how do we course correct when we make an experiment thinking, oh, let's try it, what can it hurt? And then we find out that it does hurt people, it does hurt the quality of their lives, and then the next mayor who's elected has to try to undo it. I have an anecdote about Mayor Allison when I was first running and kind of seeking her advice as a mentor, and she said, Susan, I will tell you, whenever you get between men and their money, you're going to have some challenges. I will never forget her saying that to me, looking me straight in the eye and giving me that piece of advice. And unfortunately, I'm looking at follow the money. Who benefits from this? If our own staff is telling us that the plexes in the core are not for affordability, that's not what we're going to get. Then what are we trying to get with putting plexes in the core neighborhood? I would say, I'm not against plexes, but let's put them where they belong. Let's put them in areas that are not developed yet, where we can develop bungalows, row houses, townhouses in a manner that is appropriate, that does not tread on the toes of the core neighborhood residents who have invested in homes. And there is diversity there. There are already plexes there. There are houses that are rentals. So what are we trying to accomplish here? I've got to question that every time this issue comes up, that I think we don't want to be careless in our upzoning. We don't want to have the negative unintended consequences. One last thing with respect to oftentimes when we run out of arguments that are rational and positive and supporting what you believe, we tend to resort to name calling. And as Councilmember Volan has warned us, students are people. We treat people with all due respect, regardless if they're here temporarily as students at Indiana University or whether they're long-term residents. But let's none of us resort to the easy labels, NIMBY, YIMBY, the sky is falling, relentless attacks, you're fixated on this, being opposed to the plexus. Let's all tamp that down, because there are good people in this community who are students. There are good people here who are long-term residents who know and have lived through the history of housing in this community and are legitimately afraid. That is not being fixated. That's not, being, oh, the sky is falling, we're afraid of students, or we're afraid of this, that, or the other thing. No, there are legitimate things for us to be concerned about. And so from this point on, again, I encourage the language of be respectful. Regardless of where people are coming from, they mean well. They are well-intentioned. Our job up here is to try to sift through the confirmation bias, the academics of politics, get to the truth of the matter. What do we need in Bloomington? And again, let's not compare ourselves to other larger cities. Let's compare ourselves to ourselves. We're unique. We have a university right in our midst. It causes housing issues. So with that, let's all keep our heads about us, and let's get to the solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Further comments? Councilmember Volan?
I am not a debater for the sake of debate either. I'm not playing games either. I'll say it again. Students are people. Students are citizens. Students are constituents. The difference is they move every year. 28,000 of them, of the current enrollment at IU, move every year because rationally they don't want to pay summer rent. They're not here for the summer. That means they need to make their decision to find a new place to live every year unless they want to pay 3 months' rent. I don't think it's an unreasonable thing to understand that. But every time a homeowner comes up, they say, we worry about our properties. There's only citizens who count are homeowners. Are there any renters who have spoken before us during this debate? Are there any renters who wrote objections that we're considering tonight? None that I've seen. I have colleagues who say people want single-family houses, as though that's true for all people. Let's start with me. Although I live in a single-family house now, I never really wanted one. I've complained about gutters and lawns. I don't particularly like them. I'd prefer to live in an apartment. I can assure you that there are plenty of people who don't feel the need to live in a single-family house, who don't feel the need to have a yard, but they have precious few places they can buy if they're even in the market to buy. And as we've noted, 2/3 of housing is rental. That's not because everyone in that category wants to buy a house. But we keep hearing how students are destroying the neighborhoods. I mean, I would humbly suggest that maybe it's not the students that are destroying the neighborhood, it's the policies of the state entity that we have a Stockholm Syndrome relationship with called IU that makes policy decisions without consulting us at all. I think we actually may all have that in common, that we agree that we wish IU would be more respectful of the decisions that we have to make in order to accommodate everyone who wants to come to this place. I've heard talk about density versus cost. Density is an answer to cost. If there's not enough density, I mean, the prices are high in neighborhoods right now because there isn't enough housing for the demand. It's as simple as that. And the difference, if there's a difference, it's not so much the single-family housing, it's the location of that housing with respect to places where people want to go. Inner core housing allows people to go somewhere without the use of a car. That saves money. If you don't need so much to spend money on a car, you're ahead of the game. You can afford more housing. All the more reason to reduce the amount of parking for new property built in the center of the city. I hear people talk about neighborhood consensus among owner-occupants, among owners. There are people living among us who are also developers. I'm not going to say that there's a difference between a small-time developer and a big one, but we don't make that distinction. It's just developers, like we say students. We were elected to serve all the citizens of Bloomington, not just low-income residents and not just landlords. We have to represent everyone. And that's why this card made me so upset. Kona is no longer affiliated directly with the city. The last time they got money from the city, they got $1,000 4 years ago for some kind of a public event. They're now a 501c3, which is prohibited from lobbying. It's prohibited specifically from asking you to contact your city council member, write a letter to the editor of the Herald to lobby council members. I question whether the card was even legal. This is not the Council of Neighborhood Associations. This is the Political Action Committee of the Association of Residential Property Owners. That's what they should be calling themselves. I think we need to think twice about all the terms that we use when we come to this debate. Thank you.
Further comment from council? Councilmember Chopra?
Yes, I'm going to try to pick up a little bit where Councilmember Volan left off. Of course, these comments are my own and not his. But the question is, who funds Kona? Where do they get their money? How did they pay for that mailer? I ran for office, and I know how expensive it is to send a mailer like that in color, both sides. It's thousands of dollars. There's also a bulk permit postage stamp on there. Whose stamp is that? Whose postage stamp is that? I just have questions, right? Because Kona is a very, very small group of people in this town. It doesn't represent, and the people that come in here and speak who are homeowners are a very, very, very small group of people in this town. I just turned 37 years old yesterday, and a lot of my friends are not homeowners. They're not homeowners because they cannot afford to buy homes in this town. And people even younger than me are really out of luck. You know, I got lucky. I got to buy a home when we could put 0% down when I was really young and I happened to be married and could afford that. But people who are younger than me cannot afford to save up and be homeowners. We've got to stop, focusing on the only people who are showing up, the only people who have the time and resources to pay attention to cats and to come to these meetings and to be part of an association like that. There are far more people in this community than those who are speaking up. And I think that as council members, we've got to keep that in our minds. Thank you.
Councilmember Sims.
We've had some trying weeks talking about UDO and upzoning. Many people say upzoning. I prefer to say rezoning. You start saying upzoning, that has different connotations, so I tend to say rezoning. A lot of the language, civility, I've heard that tonight, civility, safe and civil, being nice. I'll just let that marinate just for a second, because I think many of us step over the line. I'm not so sure it's intentional, it just is. And I hope I don't jump around here, but I don't have that much time, and there's a couple things. Over 50% of the housing we have here is rental. And I don't know the exact, I think 54% or something like that. 66. It is rental property. So for us not to be cognizant of that and to be aware of that and see how that fits, it would be ludicrous. Like some of my colleagues, I have a lot of friends that rent and would prefer to buy. There's the supply and demand, there's just not the housing stock. Now, is that going to, if we just plop 500 new houses in the county, is that going to solve our problems? Well, a lot of the folks that I know that want to buy houses may not be able to for other reasons. But we want that to some availability, so when that happens. Speaking of civility, I think many of us need to, and again, I don't think there's any ill intent, but we need to kind of say what we mean and mean what we say. For an example, essentially conditional use, or conditional use is essentially by right. I think I've clearly said that is not my understanding. So I think we need to, just quit trying to get those together. And I'm not advocating one for the other, just the differences. Okay? I also heard up here, and again, I would not suspect that there was any ill meaning here, but talking about old administrations and old planning departments, and the comments was, well, people were upset and there were signs around town and it didn't exactly say lynch, but that's what they really meant for Tim Miller. I know Tim Miller. Okay? I think we just need to be sensitive with some of the things that we say and understand that it's a broader, we have broader people here, and we just need to be more sensitive with some of the things that we say. Now, we've all got, everyone up here has got different reasons for UDO. My main thing for sitting on this city council, and we do know some of the historical implications involved here, but my main thing is to decide as socially just and as equitably as I can in order to eliminate discrimination and unfair treatment of minorities and marginalized and everyone else in this community. It's just that simple for me. So many of the decisions, is it going to help society, make it more equitable, more socially just, more fair for everybody? Those are the things that I look for. Yes, I am concerned with climate change. I've read the IPCC. I've talked with all of our folks and many that we hear at the podium. I've had coffee, and my understanding has been broadened. It is very, very important to be considered. And it says, for an example, we need to cut 50%, and someone correct me this, 50% emissions by 2050. What if 400 years ago we would have said we want to cut all discrimination by 1800? and we had that type of urgency. So many of these that we're talking about, there are urgencies, but understand there is a basket of urgencies that make this a community and that we all must consider. Thank you very much.
Councilmember Ruff.
Yeah, I'll just say that I think most of the controversial aspects of the proposed UDO will be coming, amendments will be coming forward related to those in some way or other, and there'll be plenty of opportunity, I feel myself, to be able to comment at those at that time. So I don't really feel a strong need to make any additional comment right now. Thank you.
Any other comments? I'll make mine. Okay, I've been looking at the our comprehensive plan and referring to it in terms of determining whether plexes and upzoning is appropriate. And there's a lot to say, but I would just like to say that regarding development themes for land use classifications, there are three types. One is to maintain, another is to enhance, and another is to transform. The maintain category contains older residential neighborhoods. Those are ones that we should replicate, that we should maintain, that we should protect. Enhance are those that have lost their integrity, that we need to enhance through the process of looking at what we would want to maintain and replicating that. And then there are those land uses that we want to transform, and those areas are those areas that are virtually empty or need redevelopment. It's clear to me that plexes pertain to, in some cases, enhance, but more likely transform. The existing neighborhoods that we're talking about placing plexes in are those that we seek to maintain, not to transform. And so we're at cross purposes. The most affected neighborhoods by this kind of density will be the Corbin neighborhoods. Those are the most dense. In many ways, they're the most affordable. Think of small homes in Green Acres, and the most cohesive. And we can refer back to history in terms of the problems related to the cohesiveness. It's certainly dependent upon number of residents who are owner-occupied versus renters. There's no question. And it's about people who are established versus people who are transient. I'm not against people who are renters, but there is some kind of balance. And the comprehensive plan speaks again and again in terms of its preference for owner occupancy and incentives in enhancing owner occupancy. So to me, it is really working against our theme in the comprehensive plan to have plexes in these neighborhoods. There are places for density. We do need density. We're on the verge of increasing density downtown by almost tenfold over the last 20 years. So we've been effective at that. But we're not lacking undeveloped areas. For instance, the Kmart site, the hospital site, Sudbury Area 7, or the north and south corridors. Those are places we can develop, and we can develop a number of different housing sites. I'd also like to refer to the housing study that was just completed, which is a regional opportunity initiative study that described that the most sought-after housing are single-family homes. And if we're going to eliminate those single-family homes, and I would argue the most affordable, because those in, say, in Green Acres, the small single-family homes are the most affordable. We're going to be working at cross purposes, removing affordability and the single-family homes that people desire. Where will they find them? They'll find them on the periphery. That's not sustainable. It's not sustainable to buy single-family homes in Ellettsville and then to commute to IU every day. That's hardly sustainable. So I will support removing the conditional use from the UDO because, as we know, and I think Councilmember Sturbaum is correct, the history shows that conditional use, by and large, in probably 90% of the time, or some function thereof, results in the use. And so I consider it very close to permitted use, and I'll conclude there. So with no other comment, I think we're exhausted comments, everyone's spoken. We move on to any other matters. We have a request. Do we have time? We have no time limits on comment? Or we do have time limits. Or is there any time remaining?
4-minute limit. We didn't specify debate.
Can you keep it brief?
Yes.
But if he speaks, then everyone else will get a chance to speak.
All right, let's keep our comments down to 30 seconds because I think we've all basically used almost all of our time. Councilmember Sturbaum.
Some people didn't agree with what Kona published, and they called it lies, and it was not. It was published because the newspaper had not been letting people know what was happening. We would talk to people, and they had no idea that there was an upzone coming. And I don't know why that happened. That's why I believe Kona wanted to let this information out. And we debated talking about each point by point. We decided, no, we know what that said. And I think it's a matter of kind of attacking the messenger. I'm sorry to say.
We'll have to leave it at that,
Thank
Councilmember
you.
Sturbaum, because any other 30-second bites of the apple? Councilmember Volin.
Yeah, there were lies in it. We don't have time to go through them. And it doesn't really matter. What matters is a 501c3 is not supposed to be doing political lobbying, and they did. So these are facts, and I look forward to seeing them addressed. But, we also need to think about the future. If we're thinking about climate change, this is my 10-second limit. It's good. It's done. If we're thinking about climate change, where is the housing in the next 20 years that we're going to be needing housing in 20 years too? Where are we going to build it? Will it ever get built?
Any other comment? Okay, seeing none. Any other matters or actions related to this proposal ready to be raised at this meeting? No? Mr. Sherman? Okay, then is there a motion to recess? And we will reconvene for our deliberations on Wednesday, November 13th at 6 p.m. here, and we will be hearing amendments
Point of
at that
information,
time.
Mr. Chair, important point of information.
Please.
I want to just confirm that the deadline for amendments to the UDO is Monday, the 4th of November, this coming Monday. Is that right? At noon. So if there is anyone who is interested in seeing language in the UDO changed, replaced, or added, they are welcome to submit it to any councilmember they like. Councilmembers know that the deadline is then, but I would urge everyone that anyone can write legislation. Send us your suggested language. We're all receptive to it. But do it as soon as possible because the deadline is Monday at noon. Thank you.
Yes.
November 13th and also the 14th, 6 o'clock, and we're taking up amendments, and we won't be done after the 14th.
No, we won't. Guaranteed. Is there a motion to recess?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor of recessing?
Aye.
Any opposed? We are recessed.